catalogue arrives on a Thursday. It is printed on paper the colour of old cream, and it smells of ink and ambition, and somewhere near the back, between an advertisement for a patented lung tonic and a cure for nervous exhaustion, there is a small boxed notice that will stop you entirely. Sanitized Tapeworms, it reads. Fat, the ideal tapeworm. Guaranteed harmless. Price, $2. You are standing in a kitchen in 1900. The window looks out over a yard where a horse is standing very still, doing nothing in particular. The catalogue is spread open on the table beside your coffee cup. The coffee has gone cold. You've been reading for longer than you meant to. $2. The price of 2 pounds of butter. The price of a decent pair of gloves. The price of inviting a tapeworm to take up residence inside your body, in the belief, the sincere, medically adjacent, deeply human belief, that it will eat what you do not want eaten. You set the catalogue down, you pick it back up. The thing is, it sounds almost reasonable. A natural solution, the copy says. Nature's own weight regulator. No dieting, no starvation. Simply order, swallow, and let the body's own processes do what they were always meant to do. The language is brisk and confident. It has been written by someone who knows that confidence properly applied can make almost any idea seem ordinary. And the idea is not even especially new. Women have been taking things, swallowing things, wearing things, and starving themselves into acceptable shapes for a very long time. The tapeworm pill is only the latest version of a story that has been running, without pause or apology, for over a century. It will keep running for another 100 years beyond this kitchen, this cold coffee, this catalogue spread open on a scrubbed wooden table. You will not, as it happens, order the tapeworms, or perhaps you will. That is between you and the catalogue. But what you're about to understand, settling in, letting the evening come down around the edges of things, letting your breath slow and your shoulders drop, is that the story in this catalogue is not really about tapeworms at all. It is about something much older, much more persistent and much more interesting than any parasite. It is about what happens when a culture decides that a woman's body is a problem to be solved, and then starts selling her the solutions. 1 decade at a time, 1 amber bottle, 1 patent pill, 1 glossy magazine at a time, and it is about what those solutions have in common, every single one of them, all the way from 1900 to right now. The kitchen is quiet, the horse in the yard has not moved. Settle in. You find yourself, as you often do in these late evening hours, between things. Between the day that is almost finished and the sleep that is slowly arriving. Between what you know and what you're about to understand. This is a good place to be. Nothing is required of you here. Tonight's story covers 120 years. It moves through doctors' waiting rooms and pharmaceutical boardrooms and suburban kitchens and magazine editorial offices and research laboratories and congressional hearings. It involves a remarkable number of women, most of whose names have been forgotten, and a smaller number of companies, most of whose names have not. It involves several drugs that were once presented as miracles and later reclassified as catastrophes, and the particular quality of silence that tends to fall between those two moments. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. The thesis, if we need one, and we do not particularly, but it is there if you want to hold it, is simple. The weight loss industry does not move in a straight line. It moves in a cycle. The cycle has phases. Each phase looks different from the outside and feels different from the inside, but they are all, in their essential shape, the same phase. There is the arrival of a new solution. There is the enthusiasm. There is the evidence, selective and glowing. There is the adoption, the prescription, the purchase, the hope. There is the problem, quiet at first, that accumulates in the margins, and then there is the reckoning, which is always slower and quieter than the enthusiasm, and which leaves women holding the damage while the industry pivots, with perfect composure, to the next solution. Tapeworm pills, cigarettes, thyroid extract, amphetamines, rainbow diet pills, fen-phen, Meridia, lap bands, GLP-1 drugs, the names change, the cycle does not. You are lying somewhere comfortable right now. Let that comfort settle into you. Let the weight of the day begin to ease. The story will come to you slowly. There is no urgency in any of it. These things have already happened, and they have been resolved, or they are resolving, and your job tonight is simply to drift through them, the way you might drift through the rooms of a very large house, curious but unhurried, touching things gently. We begin at the beginning, or as close to it as history will allow, which is to say, we begin with a catalogue and a cold cup of coffee and the particular hopefulness of a woman at the start of a new century who has been told, very politely, very insistently, by doctors and magazines and the whole agreeable apparatus of modern commerce, that her body is a problem and that someone has very kindly invented the solution. She's not naive. She's simply living inside her time, the way we all do, unable to see clearly what will only become visible from a distance. What she cannot know, what none of them could know, across all the decades that follow, is that the solution in front of her is not the last one. It is only the first of many, and they will all, in their own way, begin exactly like this, with hope, with a promise, with something in a bottle. Let us begin with what the word sanitized was doing in that advertisement, because it is doing a great deal of work for a very small word. The tapeworm pills sold in the early 1900s were not, most historians now believe, actual tapeworms. They were almost certainly inert. They were pills. The word sanitized was then not to describe a sterilization process, but to perform one, to take something that would otherwise cause an immediate and visceral revulsion, and wrap it in just enough clinical language to make it sound like a considered medical choice, rather than an act of consuming a parasitic worm. This is the first technique in the weight loss industry's very long playbook. Take the alarming thing and give it a name that sounds like science. It works extraordinarily well. It has been working since before 1900 and it has not stopped working yet. The Victorian era that preceded the tapeworm pills had its own body obsessions, and they were not quite the same as ours. Victorian beauty ideals ran toward the rounded, the soft, the abundantly curved. A well-fleshed silhouette was a sign of prosperity, of health, of a family that ate well. Thinness was what consumption looked like. Thinness was what poverty looked like. A thin woman in 1870 was a woman the world quietly worried about. But something was shifting as the century turned. American culture was becoming increasingly anxious about bodies in a new way, and the anxiety was being organized and amplified by new tools that the Victorian era did not have access to. Mass circulation magazines, national advertising, the photograph, and something called the life insurance industry, which had recently begun compiling tables of weight and height and mortality, and which had concluded, with the confident authority of actuarial data, that heavier bodies correlated with shorter lives. The Metropolitan Life Insurance Company began publishing its height-weight tables in 1897, and those tables would haunt American women for the next century and beyond. So by 1900, you have a confluence of forces. You have new media capable of circulating images of ideal bodies to millions of women simultaneously. You have a new scientific-seeming authority declaring that weight was a medical issue rather than a matter of personal circumstance. And you have an emerging consumer economy hungry for products to sell to women who have been newly persuaded that they have a problem that needs solving. Into this atmosphere, the weight loss industry was born, not with the tapeworm pill specifically, which was only one product among many, but with the general idea that a woman's weight was a commercial opportunity. The products on offer in 1900 were gloriously various. There were obesity powders, fine white preparations that promised to act on the body's natural processes without the inconvenience of actually changing what one ate. There were rubber garments designed to sweat the weight away, which worked in roughly the same way a very small portable sauna would work, which is to say temporarily and unpleasantly. There were vibrating belts and electrical treatments administered by entrepreneurs who had discovered that women would pay very well for something that sounded advanced. There were patent medicines in amber bottles, with names like Dr. Gordon's obesity tablets and reducing salts and Lamar reducing soap, the soap being perhaps the most optimistic product in the catalogue, on the theory that if you washed with sufficient persistence, the excess of you might simply rinse away. The soap did not work. None of them worked particularly. But they shared something important. They were premised on the idea that weight loss was something that should happen to you, passively, through a product or a treatment, rather than something you achieved through the sustained and unglamorous work of eating less or moving more. This premise, that the right product would do the work so you didn't have to, is perhaps the most durable idea the weight loss industry has ever produced. It is still producing it, It will be producing it long after we have gone to sleep. The tapeworm pill, real or fictional, was simply the most vivid expression of this premise. Why alter your behaviour when you could simply swallow something and let it handle the problem? The tapeworm, or the sanitized ideal mail-order approximation of one, would eat what you ate and the weight would simply disappear, as though by nature's own gentle magic. The body's own processes, no dieting, no hardship. The advertisements for these products shared a particular tone. They were written with calm authority, as though the matter were settled. They cited medical endorsement or implied it. They deployed the language of science with the casual confidence of people who understood that most readers could not verify scientific claims and would respond to the vocabulary of verification whether or not the verification itself was present. Medically approved, scientifically formulated, guaranteed results. This too is durable. Open any weight loss advertisement from any decade of the following century and the same vocabulary is there. The words change with the fashions. The structure does not. The women who bought these products were not uniformly credulous or unintelligent. They were women living inside a system that had recently decided, with considerable commercial enthusiasm, that their bodies were inadequate as they were. They were making rational responses to that declaration. They were trying to fix the inadequacy. The tragedy of the era, a tragedy that will repeat itself at 10-year intervals for the rest of this story, is not that the women were foolish. It is that the inadequacy was invented. The problem was manufactured and then the solution was sold to the people who had just been taught to feel the problem. The early 1900s products were mostly harmless, in the specific sense that their primary active ingredient was optimism. The inert tapeworm pill would not give you a tapeworm. The reducing soap would not dissolve your fat. But the products that followed, in the decades to come, as the weight loss industry grew more sophisticated and gained access to increasingly powerful tools, would not be harmless at all. For now, though, the kitchen is quiet. The catalogue is still open. The horse in the yard has not moved, and somewhere across America, in the first years of the new century, several million women are reading the same small advertisements and feeling the same new, particular kind of hope. The hope that this time, perhaps, there is something in a bottle that will actually work. There always is, and there always is a next time. We will follow the cycle as it turns. It is very patient, this cycle. It has all the time in the world. The culture that produced the tapeworm advertisement was not, it should be said, one that lacked information about the body. The early 1900s were a period of significant expansion in popular science journalism, in magazines like Popular Science Monthly and McClure's magazine, which carried articles about medicine, hygiene and physiology to a readership hungry for the language of modernity. Women who read these magazines were not scientifically illiterate. They were genuinely engaged with the new world of scientific medicine and its promises. The paradox, which is also characteristic of every subsequent era in this story, is that scientific literacy and susceptibility to commercial health claims are not mutually exclusive. They may, in certain configurations, reinforce each other. A woman who has read enough popular science to believe that medicine could solve the body's problems was also, in some respects, a woman who had been primed to believe that there was a scientific solution to her weight. The same cultural infrastructure that made her a more informed health consumer also made her a more receptive target for products framed in scientific language. The Metropolitan Life Insurance tables deserve a longer look than they usually receive in histories of this period, because they are one of the founding documents of what we might call the medicalization of the female body in the American context. Metropolitan Life began publishing weight tables in 1897 and updated them several times over the following decades, and they became the standard reference for physicians determining whether a patient's weight was within normal limits. By the 1920s, they were in use in most medical practices and were a standard feature of the health assessments conducted by life insurance examiners. The tables were built from insurance company mortality data, records of when policyholders died, correlated with their weight at the time of policy issue. This was genuine data. The correlation between higher weights and higher mortality was real in the data, though the causal relationship was more complicated than the tables implied, and the population from which the data was drawn, people who could afford life insurance in late 19th century America, was not representative of the population at large. The tables were also, for several decades, built from data on men and applied to women by extrapolation, which was not a methodological concern that anyone at Metropolitan Life found especially troubling. But the tables did something that went well beyond providing mortality estimates to actuaries. They created a number, a specific authoritative medical seeming number attached to a specific height, and they declared that number to be the goal. The ideal weight as a concept, as a target to be aimed for rather than simply a description of what was common or normal in a population, is largely an artifact of the insurance table tradition. Before the tables, your weight was simply your weight. After the tables, your weight was your weight in relation to a target, and the distance between the two was a deficit requiring correction. This transformation from weight as a neutral fact of the body to weight as a deviation from an ideal is one of the most consequential things to happen to American women's health in the 20th century, and it happened through a commercial document produced by an insurance company's actuarial department. The irony is so complete that it barely registers as an irony. The medical and cultural apparatus that would drive the weight loss industry for the next 120 years was built on a number derived not from medical research into optimal health, but from the mortality statistics of a self-selected population of insurance customers. The doctor's scale in 1910 was not simply a measuring tool, it was a judgment instrument, and the judgment it delivered was calibrated to the insurance table. A woman who stepped on that scale and received a number above the table's ideal was told she had a medical problem, not because the excess weight was producing symptoms, not because she was experiencing any particular health difficulty, but because her number exceeded the target. The medicalization of her body was complete before she complained of a single thing. The patent medicine industry of the early 1900s was, in legal terms, still relatively unregulated. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which the muckraker journalist Upton Sinclair had inadvertently helped provoke with the publicity surrounding his novel The Jungle, did begin requiring accurate labeling of contents and the removal of certain dangerous substances from over-the-counter products. But it did not require efficacy. A product could claim to produce weight loss as long as it was not making false claims about its ingredients. Whether it actually produced weight loss was a separate question that the law had not yet gotten around to asking. This meant that the obesity cream and the reducing salt and the sanitized tapeworm pill could exist not merely as frauds but as legal products, sold openly, advertised in reputable publications, purchased by women whose trust in the system of commerce and the language of medicine was not unreasonable given the world they inhabited. The fraud, if it was a fraud, was a systemic one, embedded in the absence of regulatory requirements, in the cultural conditions that made the problem saleable, in the commercial logic that incentivized the production of solutions to manufactured problems. The women who bought these products were not stupid. They were living in a world that had just told them, in the official language of insurance actuarial tables and the semi-official language of popular medical advice, that their bodies had a problem, and then it told them, in the commercially enthusiastic language of the patent medicine catalogue, that the problem had a solution available by mail order for $2. The connection was logical. The logic was built on foundations the women had not been asked to inspect. This is the founding condition of the entire 120-year story. The problem is manufactured. The solution is sold. The women who buy the solution are rational actors in an irrational system. Their rationality is never the failure. The failure is always structural, always prior to the individual decision. The early 1900s patent medicine era ended not with a decisive reckoning but with a slow accumulation of regulation. The Shirley Amendment of 1912 prohibited fraudulent health claims. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 controlled opiates and cocaine, removing some of the more potent components from the over-the-counter product landscape. The Federal Trade Commission, established in 1914, began developing the authority to address advertising fraud. These were gradual, incomplete, contested improvements in a regulatory environment that still left considerable room for products that were not quite medicines and not quite food, and that occupied the space in between with maximum commercial advantage. The weight loss products did not vanish when the regulations tightened. They adapted. The ones that had relied on narcotics removed the narcotics and replaced them with something else. The ones that had made explicit medical claims reformulated their advertising to imply the claims without making them. The innovation in this space was not scientific. It was legal and linguistic. The products were not getting better at what they claimed to do. They were getting better at being difficult to prosecute. This too is characteristic of the cycle. The regulatory tightening does not end the era. It redirects it, shapes it, forces the commercial activity to find new channels. The demand is not touched by the regulation. The demand is structural, and where demand is structural and enduring, supply finds its way. 1925. The advertisement takes up a quarter page in a women's magazine. A woman is pictured in a white dress, her silhouette spare and elegant, and she's holding a cigarette. Beneath the image, the headline, "Reach for a Lucky instead of a Sweet." The implication is gentle, almost offhand, as though cigarettes and sweets are simply two options available to anyone with a free hand, and one of them happens to be the one that will not ruin your figure. This was the moment the tobacco industry discovered what the weight loss industry had known since the tapeworm pill, that telling a woman her body was a problem was an excellent way to sell her things. The Lucky Strike campaign of the mid-1920s is one of the great case studies in the history of advertising, and its genius, the word applies, however dark, was not in creating the idea that thin was better. That idea was already well established by 1925, built slowly over the preceding decades by the combined efforts of the insurance actuaries and the fashion magazines and the new culture of the moving image, which preferred its female subjects long and lean in a way that the static portrait had never quite demanded. What the Lucky Strike campaign did was attach a product to an anxiety that already existed. It did not need to create the fear. It simply needed to position the cigarette as the solution, and it positioned it with a specific, almost medical logic. Cigarettes suppress appetite. Everyone knew this. It was simply true. The nicotine did what nicotine does. It quieted the hunger. It raised the metabolism slightly. It gave the hands something to do instead of reaching toward the breadbasket. The cigarette was, in the bluntest pharmacological sense, an appetite suppressant. It happened to cause cancer at a rate that would eventually kill more than 400,000 Americans a year, but that was a reckoning some decades away. American Tobacco Company, which made Lucky Strikes, was run at the time by a man named George Washington Hill, who was said to have become obsessed with the idea of reaching women smokers after watching a woman on the street eat a candy bar. He hired the publicist Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, a man who had applied his uncle's ideas about the unconscious to the project of selling things to people, and together they constructed one of the most successful product campaigns in American advertising history. Bernays understood something fundamental about the weight loss market that his successors in every subsequent decade would also understand. That weight anxiety was not simply a practical matter of health or appearance. It was deeply emotional. It was tied to desire and self-worth and the particular vulnerability of women who had been taught, persistently and from a very young age, that their bodies were a measure of their value. You did not sell cigarettes to those women by talking about taste or price. You sold them by talking about what they feared losing: the figure, the waistline, the sleekness of the woman in the white dress. The campaign ran for years. Women took it up. Cigarette smoking among American women rose significantly through the late 1920s and 1930s, and weight remained one of the consistent selling points in tobacco advertising for decades beyond the initial Lucky Strike campaign. The logic was durable because the anxiety was durable. As long as thinness was the ideal, and as long as cigarettes demonstrably helped women maintain thinness, the product had a weight loss use case. That it was also slowly destroying their lungs was not, for a very long time, something the advertising mentioned. This is the second great lesson of the weight loss cycle. Once a product is established as a solution to the body problem, the harm it causes tends to be processed very slowly, and in the meantime the product keeps selling. Women who might have rejected cigarettes on other grounds found themselves drawn to them through the weight control narrative. And once you're smoking for your figure, stopping means confronting the weight gain that often follows, a return of the appetite that the nicotine had been suppressing, a particular physical cruelty that tobacco companies were very happy to remain quiet about. The cigarette as weight loss tool was effective. That is the uncomfortable fact at the centre of this chapter, and it is worth sitting with it in the dark without rushing past it. The cigarette worked, in the narrow sense that the tapeworm pill did not. Women who smoked tended to be thinner, on average, than women who did not. The price of that thinness, measured eventually in lung cancer, heart disease, stroke, and early death, was paid later, and by then the industry had long since moved on to other campaigns. The 1920s were not entirely consumed by cigarette as diet aid. There were, running parallel, an entire ecosystem of other products. Thyroid extract was popular in this era. Doctors had discovered that the thyroid regulated metabolism and had concluded with the characteristic optimism of an early century physician that doses of the thing would rev the engine and burn the fuel faster. This was true in the same way that flooding a car engine is true to the principle of fuel consumption. Women were given thyroid extract at doses far beyond what a healthy thyroid would produce, and the results included heart palpitations, tremors, and in some cases cardiac episodes. The thyroid extract era faded when its effects became impossible to ignore, and the women who had experienced those effects mostly suffered them quietly, because 1930 was not a moment when women's pharmaceutical side effects commanded particular medical attention. There were also dinitrophenol preparations, DNP, which were perhaps the single most genuinely dangerous weight loss drug of the century's first half. DNP works by uncoupling the cellular process that generates energy, essentially making the body run hot and burn fuel wildly and without efficiency. Women who took it did lose weight, dramatically and fast in the way that a fever burns calories. They also experienced sweating so severe it soaked through clothing, a peculiar yellow discoloration of the skin, cataracts, and in a number of cases that are recorded but not well publicized, death. DNP was used as a weight loss preparation through the early 1930s and was eventually taken off the market after a series of fatalities, though the exact number is difficult to establish because the reporting of women's deaths from diet preparations was not, in 1935, a priority of any official record-keeping body. The pattern is visible from here, in a way it was not visible from inside it. Each solution arrives with confidence. Each solution works partially for some women, for a while, through mechanisms that have costs. The costs become impossible to ignore. Eventually, always eventually. And the solution is withdrawn or abandoned. And the space it leaves behind is immediately occupied by the next solution, which arrives with exactly the same confidence and which has its own costs waiting in the future like a letter that hasn't been opened yet. The cigarette era lasted decades rather than years, because the harm was very slow to establish itself medically, and because the tobacco industry was very well funded and very motivated to prevent that establishment. But the 1950s would bring something that made the cigarette look, by comparison, almost restrained. Something that moved faster, worked harder, and required a prescription. Something prescribed by doctors, blessed by medicine, and consumed by millions of women who were told, very sincerely by very credentialed people, that it was safe. The diet pill era was about to begin, and it would begin, as all the best catastrophes do, with excellent intentions. For now, the evening is deepening. The light is different now, softer, longer, the particular quality of late light that makes everything look slightly more golden than it actually is. The cigarette advertisement is still there on the magazine page, slightly yellowed by time, the woman in her white dress holding her lucky strike with the languid confidence of someone who has solved the problem. She has not solved the problem, but she does not know that yet. Nobody knows that yet. This is what the inside of the cycle looks like, not sinister, not dramatic, just ordinary. Just a woman with a cigarette in a white dress in 1925 doing what she has been told is the sensible thing. The 1920s were not only about cigarettes, though the Lucky Strike campaign was undeniably its most visible weight loss story. The decade was also the era in which the fashion industry and the beauty industry began to operate as a coordinated system for producing and sustaining body dissatisfaction in ways that made the patent medicine catalogues of the 1900s look almost amateurish by comparison. The flappers, the young women of 1920s popular culture whose bobbed hair and short dresses have become iconic, were thin in a way that was new in the American cultural mainstream, not the healthy-seeming slenderness of athletic activity, but a kind of deliberate reduction, an angular, boyish silhouette that required for many women the active suppression of naturally curvier bodies. Fashion had not simply reflected thinness as an ideal. It had made thinness structurally necessary for participation in the fashion. The drop-waisted dresses of the 1920s simply did not work on the bodies that corsets had previously accommodated, and the transition was not comfortable for everyone it excluded. Vogue magazine, which had been published since 1892 but was rapidly becoming the authoritative visual text of feminine aspiration in the 1920s, began in this decade to feature a very specific female body type, with an exclusivity that had not quite characterized its earlier issues. The models in Vogue by the mid-1920s were thin in a way that expressed an ideal rather than simply a range. The photographs, still relatively new as a fashion medium, transmitted the ideal with a directness that the illustrated image had never quite achieved. You could see exactly what the aspirational body looked like. The gap between that image and your own reflection was measurable in a new, specific way. The combination of fashion imagery, tobacco advertising, and the continued development of the popular medical press created, through the 1920s and 1930s, a cultural environment in which body management was a constant, low-level, ongoing project for women. Not a crisis, but a maintenance regime, a daily awareness, a running assessment of where one stood in relation to where one was supposed to be. This is different from any previous period, and it is important to mark the difference. The Victorian woman was not constantly managing her body in this way. She managed her presentation, her corset, her carriage, her dress, but the body underneath was less relentlessly evaluated and more privately inhabited. The new cultural environment of the 1920s made the body itself the ongoing project, and when the body is the project, the tools for working on the body become necessities rather than luxuries, and the market for those tools becomes enormous and permanently open. The cigarette as diet aid persisted through the 1930s, 1940s, and into the 1950s, even as the conversation about smoking and health began, slowly, quietly, resisted strenuously by the tobacco industry, to develop. Ernst Winder and Evarts Graham published their landmark study linking smoking to lung cancer in 1950 in the Journal of the American Medical Association. The study was significant. Its reception by the tobacco industry was immediate and effective. Within a year, the major tobacco companies had established the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, which spent decades funding research designed to cast doubt on the smoking cancer link without actually disproving it. The strategy of manufacturing doubt, of funding research not to find truth but to complicate it, to keep the scientific question appearing unresolved long after the scientific community had effectively resolved it, is one of the most consequential commercial strategies of the 20th century. It was deployed first by the tobacco industry, and the template it established would be used again, in modified forms, by other industries whose commercial interests were threatened by the accumulation of inconvenient scientific evidence. The weight loss pharmaceutical industry would encounter the same strategic situation in later decades, and the response would have structural similarities to what the tobacco companies did in 1950. But in 1935, the smoking cancer link was not yet established in public consciousness, and women who reached for their lucky strike instead of a sweet were not, in any way they could have understood themselves as, doing something that would damage their health. They were doing what the advertising told them was the wise choice. They were following the cultural script available to them. The harm was accumulating in the future, in biology, at a rate the individual could not perceive. There is a particular kind of patience required to think about people who were being harmed by things they could not see. The 1930s woman who smoked for her figure was not unaware of health concerns. She read the newspapers, she had a doctor, she was not cut off from information. She simply did not have access to the specific piece of information that would have changed her behaviour, because that information did not yet exist in a form that had reached her. The harm was real. Her knowledge of it was impossible. These two things coexist in the history without resolving neatly into a story about someone's fault. The 1940s interrupted the diet culture conversation in the way that large historical events tend to interrupt cultural conversations, not by ending them, but by displacing them temporarily, and then returning them, changed, in the aftermath. The war created circumstances in which women's bodies were, for several years, evaluated primarily in terms of their capability rather than their appearance. Women who were doing factory work and agricultural labour and the 1,000 practical tasks of a wartime home economy were bodies in use, and the use mattered more than the shape. Food rationing, which in Britain continued until 1954, meant that the abundance that drives diet culture, the need to restrict when restriction is possible, was somewhat beside the point. You ate what there was. But the post-war period brought the abundance back, and with it the anxiety about abundance, and with it the entire apparatus of diet culture, refreshed and newly equipped with exactly the pharmaceutical tools that the next chapter of this story will describe in detail. The 1950s housewife emerged from the 1940s into a world that had decided, with remarkable speed and thoroughness, that her role was domestic perfection, and that domestic perfection included a particular kind of body: slim, well-dressed, energetic, managed. The cigarette was still there, but something stronger was coming. The Lucky Strike advertisement that opened this chapter was printed in a world that had not yet invented the television, not yet developed the internet, not yet built the algorithm that would, in a future decade, learn to serve body image content with unprecedented precision to the person most vulnerable to it. By 1925 standards, the machinery for producing body dissatisfaction was already remarkably sophisticated. By later standards, it was only the beginning. The green of the woman's dress in the advertisement has faded to something approximate in the archive copies. The cigarette in her hand is a sliver of white, but the message is as legible as it was on the day it was printed. Your body is something that needs managing. Here is the tool, here is the price, here is the confidence of a system that knows exactly what it is doing and has every reason to keep doing it. Amphetamine was synthesized in 1887 by a Romanian chemist named Lazar Edeleanu, working in Berlin, who was primarily interested in it as a derivative of ephedrine, and who could not have imagined, had no reason to imagine, that the compound he had produced would eventually be packaged in small orange tablets and consumed every morning by millions of women in post-war American suburbs. The compound sat in relative obscurity for decades. It was rediscovered in the late 1920s by researchers looking for a synthetic substitute for ephedrine, which was used to treat asthma. In 1929, a pharmacologist named Gordon Alice synthesized it independently, tried it on himself, and noted in his lab journal an elevated mood, a sense of heightened capability, and a dramatically diminished appetite. Alice licensed his work to a pharmaceutical company called Smith, Kline and French, which recognized what it had and moved quickly. The first commercial amphetamine product was Benzedrine, introduced in 1932 as an over-the-counter inhaler for nasal congestion. It looked like a small cylindrical device, something you'd hold under your nose and breathe through, and it was sold in drugstores without a prescription. Within a fairly short time, people had discovered that you could break open the inhaler, extract the drug-soaked paper inside, and consume it directly, which produced effects significantly more dramatic than nasal decongestant. Benzedrine became a recreational drug almost before the regulators had noticed it was a drug at all. By the late 1930s, Benzedrine was available in pill form still over the counter, and it was being taken for a remarkable variety of purposes: to stay awake, to improve exam performance, to treat mild depression, to lose weight. The appetite suppression that Gordon Alice had noted in his own lab journal was real and consistent, and in a culture that was already committed to thinness as a female virtue and becoming more so, this property was noted. Then the war came, and amphetamine's relationship with American society changed entirely. World War II was, among many other things, a large-scale trial of amphetamine on military populations. The United States military distributed amphetamines, primarily Benzedrine, to pilots, soldiers, and sailors who needed to stay alert for extended operations. Britain did the same, so did Germany, though German forces used a related compound called Pervitin, manufactured by a pharmaceutical company called Temla and distributed to troops in quantities that later military historians found staggering. Pervitin was reportedly used during the invasion of France in 1940, the speed of which, the Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War, was in part attributed by some analysts to the chemical alertness of the soldiers carrying it out. American military records suggest that approximately 200 million amphetamine tablets were dispensed to US forces during the war. British forces consumed around 72 million tablets. These figures are estimates, and they are large enough that sitting with them for a moment is worthwhile. This was not a marginal use. This was a pharmaceutical intervention at industrial scale, affecting millions of young men who came home from the war with a body memory of what the drug felt like, and a culture that had just spent 4 years treating amphetamine as a legitimate medical tool. The post-war era was, in ways that are easy to underestimate from here, a period of extraordinary pharmaceutical confidence. The war had produced penicillin, sulfur drugs, blood plasma transfusions, and an entire infrastructure of industrial medicine that had very visibly saved lives on a massive scale. The doctor's authority had never been higher, the drug industry had never been better funded or more admired, and the culture was genuinely, excitedly, not unreasonably convinced that chemistry could solve problems that effort and behaviour had failed to solve. Into this atmosphere arrived the post-war housewife and her body and the question of what to do about it. The post-war American ideal for women was narrow and specific. Thinness, a different thinness than the Victorian roundness, a different thinness even from the 1920s slim silhouette, had become thoroughly medicalised by the 1950s. Your doctor weighed you at your checkups. Your doctor commented on the result. The Metropolitan life insurance tables were still circulating, still declaring certain weights too heavy for certain heights, and doctors used them as a kind of scorecard for their female patients. This is important to understand because it changes the texture of what follows. Women were not taking diet pills in the 1950s and 1960s out of vanity alone. They were following medical advice. Their doctors had told them they were too heavy. Their doctors had given them a target weight. And when diet and exercise failed to reach that target, as they very often did, because the targets were drawn from insurance tables that were not designed as health guidelines but as actuarial tools, their doctors quite sincerely reached for the prescription pad. Dexedrine, which was dextroamphetamine, the specific isomer of amphetamine that produced the most pronounced stimulant effects, was introduced as a diet drug in 1950 by Smith, Kline and French. It was explicitly marketed for obesity management. It was legal. It required a prescription, but obtaining one was, for most women in the 1950s, not especially difficult. Doctors gave it readily. It worked, visibly, on the scale. And it had an additional quality that made it genuinely popular in a culture running at the frantic pace of post-war America. It made you feel wonderful. This is the thing about amphetamine that no history of this era can quite avoid. It was not just an appetite suppressant. It was a mood elevator. It was an energy drug. A woman who took her morning Dexedrine did not simply feel less hungry. She felt capable, alert, efficient, and good about things. The house got cleaned. The correspondence got written. The children got attended to with a particular focused briskness that felt, from the inside, like being at one's best. The pharmaceutical companies understood this. They marketed it. The advertising for diet amphetamines in the 1950s and early 1960s does not dwell on weight loss as its primary benefit. It dwells on the woman who has her life under control. The woman who is managing everything. The woman who is energetic and pleasant and thin and efficient. The weight loss is presented almost as a side effect of being well. The drug is presented as what being well feels like. Women took it by the millions. Estimates vary, but by the mid-1960s, somewhere between 3.5 million and 8 million Americans, the vast majority of them women, were taking prescription amphetamines regularly. This was not a hidden epidemic. It was not underground. It was happening in doctors' offices and drugstore pharmacy counters and kitchen cabinets across suburban America, in broad daylight, with the full endorsement of the medical establishment. And the women who took it did not mostly think of themselves as drug users. They thought of themselves as patients following a prescribed treatment plan. They thought of themselves as women who had a medical issue, excess weight, and were treating it medically. This distinction matters enormously to understanding what came next, because what came next would be withdrawal, in both the pharmacological and the social sense, and it would be experienced not as the end of a drug habit, but as the loss of something that had been working. But that is the future. For now, it is still morning. The orange bottle is on the kitchen counter beside the coffee maker. The children are getting ready for school. The house is quiet in the particular way that houses are quiet just before the day starts. And one small white tablet is making its way through the digestive system of a woman who has been told, by a doctor she trusts, in an office she visits regularly, that this is exactly what she should be doing. She feels fine. She feels good, actually. Better than she has in a while. The post-war pharmaceutical confidence that enabled the Dexedrine era was not irrational. This point deserves emphasis because it is easy, from the present, to read the 1950s medical culture as simply credulous, and that reading misses something important. The drugs that came out of the 1940s and early 1950s, the antibiotics, the vaccines, the blood pressure medications beginning to emerge, genuinely worked. Penicillin saved lives that would otherwise have ended in sepsis. Streptomycin made tuberculosis a disease you could survive. The optimism that medicine was solving the body's problems was not wishful thinking. It was based on real evidence of real efficacy. The culture of pharmaceutical confidence that produced the Dexedrine era was, in other words, an earned confidence, transferred from contexts where it was justified to contexts where it would prove less warranted. The human mind is not always good at distinguishing between these contexts. A doctor who had watched penicillin work miracles in the treatment of bacterial infections was not unreasonable to bring some of that confidence to the prescribing of a new pharmaceutical for a new clinical problem. The confidence was correct in its origin. Its transfer was the problem. Smith, Klein, and French, the manufacturer of Dexedrine, was not a shadowy entity operating outside the mainstream of respectable pharmaceutical enterprise. It was one of the most established and respected drug companies in America. It had been in operation since 1830, when it was a Philadelphia apothecary. It had expanded through the late 19th century into a major pharmaceutical manufacturer, had produced the first commercially successful antihistamine in America with chlortrimetin, and was regarded as an innovative and responsible participant in the pharmaceutical industry of its era. This context matters because it changes the story from one about a predatory fringe operation to one about how ordinary, reputable, scientifically minded institutions can produce serious harm through the accumulation of individually defensible decisions. The decision to market Dexedrine as a weight loss medication was defensible. The clinical evidence supported it. The decision to invest heavily in detail man infrastructure to expand prescribing was standard pharmaceutical practice. The decision not to fund long-term studies of continuous use was economically rational and consistent with the regulatory requirements of the era. No single decision, examined alone, looks like a catastrophe. The catastrophe emerged from all of them together, over time, in the lived experience of millions of women. The wartime use of amphetamines by military forces created a substantial body of knowledge about the drug's effects that was, in most respects, not transferred effectively into the civilian prescribing context. Military experience with amphetamines had produced clear observations about their effects at high doses, the paranoia, the psychosis in some cases, the physical consequences of extended stimulant use. But these observations were made in a context so different from the civilian therapeutic context that the transfer of knowledge was partial at best. A pilot taking amphetamines for an 18-hour bombing mission was not a suburban housewife taking a small daily dose for weight management over several years. The doses were different. The duration of use was different. The circumstances were entirely different. And yet both were described in the general category of amphetamine use, and the absence of catastrophe in the short-term military context was implicitly, not explicitly, not scientifically, but implicitly and culturally, taken as evidence of safety in the long-term civilian one. The Benzedrine inhaler era, the period from 1932 to the mid-1940s when amphetamine was available over the counter in inhaler form, had already produced clear evidence that the drug would be misused. By 1940, Benzedrine inhalers were being opened and consumed for recreational stimulation in quantities significant enough to prompt manufacturer concern and eventually regulatory attention. The inhalers were reformulated with less extractable drug. The abuse continued through other means. The story of amphetamine's non-medical use was visible and documented through the 1940s. It was simply not connected, in most medical and regulatory thinking of the era, to the question of what would happen when amphetamine was prescribed therapeutically to millions of women. The research on amphetamine that existed in 1950 was largely positive in its framing. Short-term studies showed appetite suppression and weight loss. Mood elevation was noted as a side effect in clinical terms, acknowledged but not dwelled upon, because in 1950 the idea that a drug's mood-elevating effects might contribute to psychological dependency in therapeutic users was not yet a standard clinical concern. Psychological dependency was understood in the context of recreational drug use, of alcohol and opiates, and the population of people who chose to take substances for the purpose of alteration. It was not easily translated to the population of women following their doctor's prescription for a medical problem. By the time it became clear that the translation was necessary, the prescriptions had been running for a decade. The pattern was established, the dependency had accumulated, and the regulatory and medical system was just beginning to develop the vocabulary to describe what it had produced. The morning with the orange bottle on the kitchen counter is not a scene of innocence betrayed. It is a scene of a woman doing what her doctor recommended, in a world that had told her clearly that her weight was a medical problem, and less clearly what the solution to that problem would eventually cost her. The cost was not hidden by villains. It was invisible to everyone in the room. It is a Tuesday in 1962, and you would like to tell someone what the day feels like from inside it, but the right words are not quite there. Not in the magazines you read, or the conversations you have at the school gate, or the brief exchanges with your husband before he leaves in the morning. Car keys already in hand, already somewhere else. The day is simply the day. Laundry, dishes, a grocery list written in pencil on the back of an envelope. The particular quality of afternoon light through kitchen curtains. But on the mornings after the pill, Dexedrine, though you mostly think of it as your little yellow tablet, the one your doctor's name gave you, the one that is helping with your weight, the day has a different quality. The list gets done. Everything gets done. There is a briskness to it, a sense of forward motion, that is so pleasant you have begun looking forward to mornings in a way you didn't before. This is what several million American women reported in the early 1960s, in the way that things get reported when they are not formally studied, in fragments, in the margins of other conversations, in the cautious confessions exchanged between women who half suspect they are not supposed to feel this good. The hunger is the first thing. It simply stops. Not suppressed exactly. Not the white-knuckled absence of hunger that dieting produces, the feeling of something being withheld from you. More like the hunger has gone somewhere else for the day. You can look at a plate of food and feel genuinely indifferent to it. You can skip lunch without experiencing it as a deprivation. The appetite has been, quietly and without drama, turned off. The second thing is the energy. It arrives with the drug, peaks around mid-morning, and carries through the afternoon in a way that ordinary coffee never quite manages. A 1950s housewife's domestic schedule was not light. The keeping of a house to the standards expected of a suburban wife and mother in post-war America was a full-time occupation, often physically demanding, always socially evaluated, and performed largely without assistance. Amphetamine made it feel manageable, more than manageable. It made it feel on the good days effortless. The pharmaceutical companies knew about these secondary benefits and were very happy to use them. Smith, Kline, and French's marketing materials for Dexedrine in the early 1960s describe a product that addresses not just weight, but the woman's overall functioning. There are brochures, aimed at doctors, that show before and after illustrations not of body size but of disposition. A woman who was managing poorly is now managing well. The pill is presented as a restoration of normal feminine capability, not a chemical intervention. The messaging is subtle and effective. Women wrote to their doctors about how the drug made them feel. Some of those letters survive in archives, in collections of pharmaceutical marketing records and medical correspondence. They speak with a particular specificity about the quality of the days, the sense of capability, the pleasure of actually finishing things, the way the afternoon stretched out in a useful rather than an empty direction. One woman, writing to her physician in 1961, described the drug as giving her back herself, and this phrase, with variations, recurs in other accounts. The drug did not feel like a crutch. It felt like access to a version of herself that had always been available but previously unreachable. This is one of the most important and least discussed aspects of the amphetamine era. The drug was not simply an appetite suppressant taken grudgingly for the scale. For many women, it was genuinely pleasurable and genuinely functional in ways that had nothing to do with weight. It addressed a kind of chronic low-level exhaustion that was common among women managing households alone, often in geographic isolation. Suburban America in 1960 was a physically dispersed place, the neighborhoods designed around the car, the days long and structurally similar, and that chronic exhaustion was not talked about because there was no language for it that wasn't quietly pathologizing. The 1963 book The Feminine Mystique, written by Betty Friedan and based partly on her surveys of Smith College alumni, had a chapter she called The Problem That Has No Name, the quiet suffocation of educated women confined to purely domestic lives. Friedan was describing something real. The amphetamine was addressing, in a chemical rather than a social way, the same real thing. Which meant that withdrawing the drug from women who had come to depend on it would not simply mean the return of the appetite. It would mean the return of everything the drug had been managing. The social context in which women took Dexedrine is impossible to separate from the pharmacological one. These were women who had been told that domestic life was fulfilling and complete. They were managing houses and children and social expectations largely alone, without acknowledgement that this was labour, without the social frameworks that would only begin to develop a decade later. They were being evaluated constantly by their husbands, their doctors, the magazines, the mirrors, on the basis of their bodies and their capability. And they were taking a drug that made both those things easier to perform. Calling this self-medication rather than medical treatment is technically accurate and also slightly unkind. They were doing what they were told to do by their doctors. The doctors were doing what the pharmaceutical companies had trained them to do. The pharmaceutical companies were doing what the market rewarded. Everyone, at every level of the system, was behaving rationally within their context. The harm was produced not by malice, but by structure, which makes it more diffuse and much harder to assign. The prescription rates are worth pausing on. By 1965, amphetamine prescriptions in the United States had reached somewhere in the region of 8 million per year. This figure comes from pharmaceutical sales data and is almost certainly an undercount because some of the amphetamines in circulation were being prescribed for conditions other than obesity, depression, fatigue, and the catch-all diagnosis of housewife syndrome, which is perhaps the most evocative medical category ever invented. Housewife syndrome was not an official diagnosis in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, but it was used informally by practitioners to describe a constellation of symptoms: lethargy, low mood, poor concentration, lack of energy, difficulty managing domestic tasks, that were treated in practice with a combination of amphetamines and reassurance. The reassurance said that this was temporary. The amphetamines made it feel less important whether it was. On a Tuesday afternoon in 1962, none of this analysis is visible. The kitchen is clean because you cleaned it, which you always do, but today it felt like less of a struggle. The grocery list is done, dinner is planned, you're going to pick the children up in an hour and you're not for once dreading it. You feel, not to put too fine a point on it, fine. You feel fine every day now, in the way you used to feel fine only on good days. The bad days have become less frequent. The grey afternoons where the list seemed to hang in the air, too heavy to address, have almost disappeared. The orange bottle on the counter is small. The tablets inside it are small. The change they produce does not feel, from the inside, like chemistry. It feels like the day deciding for once to cooperate. What you cannot know, what no one in this kitchen, in this suburb, in this year is being told, is that the bottle is going to run out, and that the day it runs out will feel different, that a particular quality of difficulty will return that you had almost forgotten was there, that the line between taking the drug and needing the drug has already been crossed, quietly, without ceremony, sometime in the last few months, that the doctor who prescribed the orange bottle does not quite have the language for what happens when patients like you stop taking it, because the concept of amphetamine dependence in 1962 is not something most physicians are trained to discuss with their patients. For now, there is dinner to plan and a grocery list to finish. The curtains are letting in the afternoon light. The coffee is warm, the house is quiet and clean and entirely manageable. And on a small slip of paper in a wallet, in a purse on the kitchen chair, there is the address of the pharmacy, and a prescription that will need refilling before the end of the month. That is a problem for later. The social geography of 1960s suburban America is important context for the Dexedrine story, and it is one that is sometimes lost when the history of the era is told primarily through cultural production. The novels, the films, the television shows that captured suburban life with varying degrees of sympathy. The physical reality of the suburb was one of significant isolation, particularly for women without paid employment outside the home. The neighbourhoods built after World War II, the Levittowns and their equivalents, the vast tracts of single-family housing constructed on the GI Bill and the post-war economic expansion, were not designed with women's independent mobility in mind. They were designed for the commuting family, in which the male household head drove to work and the female household manager stayed within the neighbourhood for the duration of the working day. The distances between neighbourhoods and commercial centres were built for the car. Without a car, or in families where there was one car and the husband had it, the suburb could be functionally an enclosure. Betty Friedan wrote about this in 1963 in terms that were initially controversial, and are now so thoroughly absorbed into the cultural understanding of the era that they can seem almost obvious. The problem that had no name, the deep, unacknowledged dissatisfaction of educated women confined to a purely domestic life, was real. Friedan found it in her surveys, physicians found it in their waiting rooms, pharmaceutical companies found it in the prescribing data. The women who took Dexedrine and found it made the days manageable were, in many cases, using a pharmaceutical intervention to cope with a structural social problem. This is a phrase that has become familiar in discussions of women and medication across many eras, the pharmaceutical management of social conditions. It is not a phrase that implies the women were wrong to take the drug. The structural social problem was real, and the drug did provide relief. It is a phrase that implies the system was addressing the symptom rather than the cause, because the cause was much harder to address and much less commercially useful than the symptom. A drug that made a woman more capable of managing her domestic life, more energetic, less hungry, less likely to be sitting in her kitchen at 3 p.m. feeling the particular weight of another empty afternoon. That drug was solving a problem. The problem it was solving was partly a weight problem and partly not a weight problem at all. It was a life problem. And the pharmaceutical solution to the life problem was much more accessible than the social solutions. Childcare, paid employment, education, the reorganization of domestic labour, that would have addressed the underlying conditions. The Dexedrine era coincided with, and possibly enabled the suppression of, what would eventually become the second wave feminist movement. This is speculative in the specific causal sense. You cannot know what would have happened to the women who took Dexedrine if they hadn't, but it is worth sitting with. The women who are most likely to become politically and socially active around the issues of women's rights in the late 1960s and 1970s were often educated, often dissatisfied, often in the precise demographic that had been most heavily prescribed the drugs. How many of them were managing their dissatisfaction pharmacologically in the years before the movement offered them a political frame for it? This is not a question with a clean answer. It is a question worth keeping company with. The particular quality of a Tuesday afternoon on Dexedrine was not simply, or even primarily, the absence of hunger. It was the absence of the grey. The grey was the mood that settled in the suburb, in the middle of the afternoon, when the morning's tasks were done and the evening was too distant to plan for and the hours between were simply hours to be gotten through. The grey was not depression, clinically speaking, in most cases. It was something more ambient than that. A kind of low-level flatness that was the emotional texture of a life organised around maintenance and repetition, without sufficient intellectual or social stimulation. Dexedrine lifted the grey. It did not solve the conditions that produced the grey, the isolation, the repetition, the narrowness of the permitted life. But it made those conditions feel temporarily less consequential, and that temporary relief was experienced by the women who felt it as genuinely valuable. The valuation was not wrong. The temporary relief was real. The cost of the temporary relief was the dependency, and the cost of the dependency was the withdrawal, and the withdrawal reproduced the grey in a more acute form than the original, and the reproduction of the grey was then used as evidence that the prescription was still necessary. This closed loop is worth understanding precisely because it is not unique to Dexedrine. It is the pharmacological structure of dependency, and it operates the same way regardless of the specific compound. The drug creates a state of relief. The absence of the drug creates a state of distress. The distress confirms the need for the drug. The loop is self-sustaining once established, and it can sustain itself for years, decades, the better part of a life. On a Tuesday afternoon in 1962, none of this analysis is available. The afternoon is simply fine. Better than fine. The list is done, the house is clean, the dinner is planned. There is a quality to the hour that feels like competence, and competence is pleasant in the specific way that things are pleasant when they have been previously elusive. She does not know what she is inside. She knows only what she is feeling, which is capable and good and on top of things. This is enough. It has to be. On a morning in 1958, a man arrived at a doctor's office in suburban Ohio carrying a briefcase. He was dressed well. He was pleasant. He had brought in the briefcase a number of things: samples, printed literature, a clinical trial summary in a format designed to be read quickly, and the particular easy confidence of someone who does this every day and has found it to be very productive. He was what the pharmaceutical industry called a detail man, a pharmaceutical sales representative in the modern language, but the older term is more evocative. His job was to detail the product, to explain its benefits, provide the literature, answer questions, leave samples, and build the kind of personal relationship with the physician that makes a product feel like a familiar friend rather than an abstraction on a formulary. He visited somewhere between 8 and 12 doctors a day. He had been doing this for 3 years. He was very good at it. The detail man is one of the largely invisible figures of the amphetamine era, and understanding how the system worked requires understanding his role. He was not a villainous figure. He was not deceiving anyone in any way that the era's norms would have recognized as deception. He was doing his job within a structure that nobody had yet decided was problematic, in a system that everyone involved, doctors, patients, companies, regulators, understood to be working. Smith, Kline and French, the manufacturer of Dexedrine, was one of the most sophisticated pharmaceutical marketing operations in the United States in the 1950s and 1960s. The company had invested heavily in the detail man infrastructure, building a sales force that covered the country, with a density that meant most physicians in most cities were visited regularly, often weekly, by representatives who knew the doctor's preferences, remembered their family names, and understood which arguments would land and which would not. The training materials for detail men in this era are genuinely interesting documents, because they were not designed to mislead in any obvious sense. They were designed to communicate a genuine product benefit in the most persuasive possible way. Dexedrine did suppress appetite. Dexedrine did produce weight loss in most patients, at least initially. The clinical trials that Smith, Kline and French provided to physicians showed this. What the trials often did not show, partly because the trials were short-term by design, and partly because the questions they were asking were weight loss questions rather than dependence questions, was what happened to patients who stayed on the drug for a year or 2 years or longer. Short-term trials showing short-term efficacy. Long-term consequences emerging over years of use by millions of patients in ways that no individual trial could capture. This is a pattern that will reappear in this story with such regularity that it begins to feel less like a problem and more like a feature. The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, which had existed in various forms since 1906 but gained significant regulatory authority with the Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act of 1938, did not have the tools in the 1950s to demand the kind of long-term safety data that would later become standard. The regulatory framework was built around acute toxicity and short-term efficacy. It was not designed to evaluate the slow accumulation of dependence over years of therapeutic use. This was not incompetence. It was the limit of the era's understanding, and the pharmaceutical companies operated within those limits with the natural diligence of entities whose business model depended on doing so. The doctors who prescribed Dexedrine did so because they believed it worked, because the literature they were given said it worked, because the detail men who visited them were credible and well prepared, and because the patients who came in were real people with a real problem, weight that their charts said was medically significant. And the drug appeared to address that problem. The prescription pad was the tool available. The drug was the appropriate use of the tool. What no one was measuring in those individual offices in those individual years was the aggregate. What happened when 8 million people were prescribed a stimulant for long-term use? What happened to appetite regulation after months or years of pharmaceutical suppression? What happened when women tried to stop? There were signals. There are always signals, and the weight loss cycle has a particular way of processing them, which is slowly, in the margins, in the experiences of individual patients who report back to individual doctors, and very rarely in any kind of systematic collection that might produce a pattern visible to anyone outside it. Women did report to their doctors and to each other that stopping the medication was difficult, that the hunger returned with an intensity that felt different from ordinary appetite, that the low mood that descended in the first weeks off the drug was not quite like the low mood of an ordinary bad week, that the exhaustion was specific and profound in a way that rest did not resolve. These reports existed. They were recorded in individual patient files. They were not aggregated. The concept of pharmaceutical dependence, as a systematic concern about a legally prescribed therapeutic agent, was not yet well developed in 1960s medical practice. Meanwhile, the detail men kept visiting. The samples kept arriving. The literature kept emphasizing efficacy and minimizing, in the polite way of pharmaceutical literature, the questions that had not yet been asked. This is one of the places in the cycle where the commercial structure and the medical structure and the regulatory structure all reinforced each other in ways that made the harm invisible until it was very large. No single actor in the system was behaving outside the norms of their profession. The doctor was practicing medicine as it was taught. The pharmaceutical company was operating within the regulatory requirements. The regulator was applying the rules it had, and the patient was doing what her doctor recommended. The harm emerged from the structure, not from any individual's bad intention. This makes it harder to narrativize. There is no villain to focus on, no clear moment of malice. But it also makes it more important to understand, because it is the same structure, in different clothes, that will produce the harm of the next era and the one after that. By 1962, Smith, Kline and French was generating approximately $200 million annually in pharmaceutical sales, a significant portion of which came from amphetamine products. The company was publicly traded, profitable, and considered a model of the modern pharmaceutical enterprise. Its detail men continued to visit their offices. Its literature continued to emphasize efficacy. Its patients continued to take their prescriptions. And in a suburb somewhere, on a Tuesday afternoon, a woman was standing in a drugstore handing over her prescription, collecting her orange bottle, feeling very ordinary about the whole transaction because it was very ordinary, in 1962, to do exactly this. The detail man who had visited her doctor 3 weeks ago did not think about her specifically. He thought about his quota, which he was meeting, and his relationships with his doctors, which were good, and about whether the new study that had just been published would help him with a particular physician who had questions about long-term use. The new study was 12 weeks long. The questions about long-term use would take much longer to answer. They always do. The detail man who called on physicians in 1958 was part of an infrastructure that by that decade had become one of the most sophisticated marketing systems in existence. Smith, Kline and French operated a sales force of several hundred representatives covering the United States. Each representative was trained, had a territory, had quota targets, and had a set of tools designed to make the physician encounter as productive as possible in commercial terms. The training manuals for pharmaceutical detail men in this era are remarkable documents. They describe a methodology built around relationship maintenance, the management of objections, and the strategic deployment of clinical information. The detail man was not simply a salesperson. He was, ideally, a trusted source of clinical information, someone the physician regarded as knowledgeable and reliable, so that when the detail man said the clinical literature supported a particular prescribing decision, the physician had a reason to believe him. This was not deception in any way the era would have recognized. The detail man did know the clinical literature, or the summary of it that his company had provided. The company had not fabricated studies. The studies existed. The detail man was communicating real clinical information, the selection of which information to communicate most prominently, which questions not to raise, which uncertainties to leave quietly in the background. This selection was the commercial art. It was not lying. It was curation. The physicians who received these visits were not passive recipients. They were professionals with their own expertise and judgment, but their expertise was in medicine, not in pharmaceutical marketing methodology, and they were operating in a context where the commercial and the educational were deliberately conflated. The detail man who brought lunch for the office staff on the way to his appointment was not bribing anyone exactly. He was building relationship. The relationship would be activated later when a prescribing decision was made. The pharmaceutical industry's financial investment in physician relationships in the 1950s and 1960s was not secret, but was also not publicly legible in the way it later became, when transparency requirements and conflict of interest rules began to make the infrastructure visible. In 1958, there was no requirement that physicians disclose their relationships with pharmaceutical companies. There was no database of payments. There were no rules preventing a physician from accepting gifts, honoraria, or conference invitations from the companies whose products he prescribed. These relationships were simply normal. The 1962 Kefauver-Harris amendments to the Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act introduced significant new requirements for pharmaceutical approval, including the now standard requirement that drugs demonstrate both safety and efficacy before marketing approval. This was a major regulatory advance, driven largely by the thalidomide crisis and the extraordinary work of FDA examiner Francis Kelsey, who had refused to approve thalidomide for the US market on safety grounds and thereby prevented the scale of harm that occurred in Europe. Kelsey was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1962 for her work, one of the early recognitions of a woman scientist's contribution to public health, in a system that often rendered such contributions invisible. Her story is worth keeping in this history, alongside the stories of the women who were harmed. The systems that produced harm were not monolithic. There were always people within them doing the work of protection. The question is always whether they have enough structural power to make the protection effective against the commercial forces aligned against it. In Kelsey's case, the answer was yes for thalidomide in the United States, but thalidomide was a drug whose harms were visible and dramatic and produced in infants, which made them impossible to minimize. The harms of long-term amphetamine use were diffuse and internal and produced in adult women, which made them much easier to set aside. The detail man collected his briefcase at the end of his last appointment of the day and drove home through suburbs that looked very much like the suburbs his client physicians lived in. His quota was met. His relationships were maintained. He had left samples and literature and a sense of goodwill. He was, by every metric his employer used to evaluate him, doing his job well. The orange bottles would be on the shelves tomorrow. They would be refilled next month. The cycle of prescribing and refilling and visiting and sampling would continue for years, at scale, across the entire country, until the regulatory environment made it impossible, and then it would find another channel as it always did. She noticed it first on a Thursday. The prescription had run out on a Wednesday, and she had not called in the refill. There had been a school meeting, and then the children needed collecting, and then it was too late to call the pharmacy, and by Thursday morning something was different. Not dramatically different. Not the kind of different that presents itself as a problem with a name. Just a quality to the morning that she had almost forgotten was the morning's default state. Heavy. That is the word she would have used if she had been writing this down, which she was not. The day felt heavy in the way it used to feel heavy before the prescription, before the Tuesday afternoons of brisk efficiency, before the orange bottle on the counter that had become so usual she barely noticed it. This is how the recognition came, for most of the women who experienced it, not in a moment of crisis, not in the dramatic withdrawal narrative that the word dependence conjures, but in the texture of an ordinary day that was suddenly, quietly, wrong. The 1960s had no widely available vocabulary for what these women were experiencing. The concept of physical dependence, the body's adaptation to a regular dose of a substance, such that the absence of the substance produced a physiological rebound, was not unknown in medicine. It was understood in the context of opiates, of barbiturates, of alcohol. But in the context of prescribed medications taken by ordinary women following their doctor's recommendations for a medically sanctioned purpose, the concept sat differently. It was not, in the clinical culture of 1960, a comfortable fit. Women who reported these experiences to their doctors were met with varying responses. Some doctors acknowledged the difficulty and managed the transition carefully, tapering doses and providing support. Others, more commonly, advised their patients that what they were experiencing was the return of the underlying problem the medication had been treating. In other words, that the appetite and lethargy and low mood were not effects of stopping the drug, but evidence of the continued need for it. This distinction, offered in good faith by physicians who genuinely believed it, had the practical effect of keeping women on amphetamines longer than might otherwise have been the case. There was also the weight. When women stopped taking dexedrine, the appetite that had been pharmaceutically quieted returned, and it returned with a compensatory intensity that was not simply the ordinary appetite of someone who hadn't been on a diet. The metabolism, adjusted to operating with chemical stimulation, ran slower without it. The hunger, suppressed for months or years, was genuinely difficult to manage. Women who stopped the drug often gained weight, sometimes rapidly, sometimes to levels above their pre-prescription weight, and this weight gain was then used by doctors, by the culture, and sometimes by the women themselves, as evidence that the medication was necessary and should be resumed. The cycle within the cycle. The drug manages the weight. Stopping the drug produces weight gain. The weight gain justifies returning to the drug. This is a pharmacological trap, and it was a very common one, and it operated within the 1960s medical system without anyone, at any level of that system, quite having the conceptual framework to identify it as a trap rather than a treatment. There is a particular kind of suffering that happens when you are experiencing something that does not have a name. You cannot report it accurately because the words for it have not been established. You cannot be treated for it because it has not been classified as a condition. You can only experience it in the private vocabulary of your own body, in the specific weight of a Thursday morning that is different from the Thursday mornings before it, in ways you cannot explain to anyone who has not also experienced it. This is what the women of the 1960s amphetamine era were dealing with, individually, in suburbs across America, without the benefit of shared experience, patient communities, medical research into their specific situation, or the social framework that would eventually produce the second-wave feminist health movement of the 1970s, with its emphasis on women's medical experience as a legitimate subject of study and advocacy. They were not, by and large, telling each other. The culture of the 1960s was not one in which women freely discussed their pharmaceutical histories. The embarrassment attached to diet drugs, the sense that needing them was an admission of weakness, that taking them was slightly shameful, meant that the common experience remained fragmented. Women who were struggling didn't know, mostly, that other women were struggling in the same way. The isolation was a feature of the era that pharmaceutical dependence exploited perfectly. There were some who noticed the pattern from the outside. A small number of physicians who had large patient populations on long-term amphetamine prescriptions began documenting what they saw. Patients who deteriorated when they stopped the medication, patients whose dose requirements increased over time, patients who exhibited the particular agitation that large doses of stimulants produce, patients who were clearly no longer using the drug for its original purpose of weight management but were using it to function at all. These observations were noted in individual practices. They were discussed in medical journals in a slow, qualified way that is characteristic of how medicine processes uncomfortable information about widely used treatments. A letter here, a case series there, a small study of patients attempting to discontinue. The aggregate picture was assembling itself in the literature piece by piece over years at a pace that bore no relationship to the pace at which prescriptions were being written. By the late 1960s, there were approximately 31 million amphetamine prescriptions being filled annually in the United States. This figure comes from DEA precursor data and the pharmaceutical sales records of the major manufacturers. It is a staggering number for a class of drugs that would, within a few years, be reclassified and regulated into near inaccessibility. But in 1968, the stagger was not visible from the inside. From the inside, it was simply the normal pharmaceutical landscape of the time. The bottle on the kitchen counter was ordinary. The prescription in the purse was ordinary. The pharmacy visit was ordinary. The Thursday morning that was a little heavy, a little grey, a little harder than the Thursdays of last month. That was ordinary too, in its way, just a bad day. Everyone had bad days. One. The recognition that the bad days were structural, that they were produced by a pharmaceutical reality rather than a personal failing, that they were happening to millions of other women in millions of other kitchens, that recognition was still some years away. It would require regulatory change and public scandal, and the particular cultural upheaval of the 1970s before the shared experience would become visible as a shared experience. For now, she refills the prescription. She makes the phone call she forgot to make yesterday. The pharmacy has it ready by afternoon. By the next Thursday, the mornings are better again, light again, manageable. She puts the orange bottle back on the counter where it lives. She does not think very hard about why the morning was better with it than without it. There is dinner to make. There are children to attend to. The day is organised and proceeding. The bottle is there. The day is fine. There is nothing else to understand about this particularly. Not yet. The women who noticed something was wrong in the 1960s were not, in general, women who were looking to cause trouble. This bears saying explicitly because the medical culture of the era had a particular way of receiving complaints from women, a way that involved a fair amount of what would now be called medical gaslighting, the dismissal of reported symptoms as anxiety, neurosis, or hypochondria. A woman who reported to her physician that she felt worse when she was not taking her dexedrine, that the mornings were heavier, that the appetite was greater, that the mood was lower, was presenting with a symptom that the era's medical framework was not well equipped to receive. If the physician's working model was that dexedrine was a therapeutic treatment for overweight, then a woman who felt worse without it was simply a woman whose underlying condition, the overweight, was reasserting itself. The logical response was to continue the medication. To discontinue it was to expose the patient to the return of the problem it had been treating. This loop, the drug treats the condition, stopping the drug reveals the condition, therefore the drug is still needed, was not a logical error in isolation. It was the application of a perfectly reasonable clinical framework to a situation that the framework had not been designed to handle, because the framework did not yet include the concept of stimulant dependency as a therapeutic problem. The women who pushed back, who said, with varying degrees of confidence, that what they were experiencing when they stopped the medication did not feel like the return of their original problem, but felt like something new and different and chemical in quality, were making an observation that was accurate and important. Most of them were not believed, not because their physicians were malicious, but because the observation did not fit the available conceptual model, and human minds, including physician minds, are very effective at not seeing things that don't fit their models. There were alternative systems where women did talk to each other about these experiences. The telephone had made women's social networks more immediate across the distances of the suburb. The bridge club, the PTA meeting, the coffee morning, these were spaces where women exchanged information about their lives with a frankness not always available in the physician's consultation room. But these conversations about dexedrine and its effects were, for most of the 1960s, conducted in the register of private exchange rather than public complaint. The language was not yet available for a woman to say to her bridge club friend, with confidence, "I think I'm dependent on this medication." She might say, "I feel strange when I don't take it." She might say, "I can't manage as well without it." But the framing that would make those observations legible as a medical and systemic problem, rather than a personal inadequacy, was not yet there. 1967 saw the publication of Jacqueline Suzanne's novel Valley of the Dolls, which became one of the best-selling novels of its decade, and which depicted in its popular fiction way the pharmaceutical lives of women who depended on various pills, reds, yellows and whites, to manage their careers and their emotions. The novel was not a precise pharmacological document, it was a thriller, a melodrama, a piece of popular entertainment that combined real-world pharmaceutical culture with dramatic fictional plotting. But its popularity, more than 30 million copies sold, indicated that it was describing something that resonated with readers, that the experience of women organising their lives around pharmaceutical management was recognisable in a way that made the book feel true even as it was fiction. The FDA began tracking amphetamine abuse more systematically in the mid-1960s, and the data that emerged confirmed what individual practitioners were observing. The drugs were being prescribed in quantities that far exceeded any plausible therapeutic justification, were being used by people in ways that went well beyond their approved indications, and were producing dependency in a patient population that had not been warned this was possible. The response was regulatory rather than medical, a tightening of the prescribing rules, an increase in oversight, and eventual reclassification of the drugs under the Controlled Substances Act. These were important steps. They were not accompanied by any systematic effort to support the women who'd been on long-term prescriptions and who would need to discontinue them. The medical system that had produced the prescriptions did not develop a parallel infrastructure for managing their end. The women who had been given the drug were largely left to navigate the discontinuation on their own, with the inadequate support of a medical culture that had not yet developed the vocabulary for what they were going through. This gap, between the creation of the pharmaceutical situation and the management of its consequences, is not unique to the dexedrine era. It recurs across every phase of this story, with a consistency that is almost structural. The system that produces the harm is never quite the same system that manages its aftermath. The aftermath is processed by individuals privately, and the learning from it accumulates very slowly into anything like systemic knowledge or systemic change. The average doctor's appointment in 1963 lasted approximately 8 minutes. This is not a figure that has been precisely documented, but it is consistent with the available evidence about physician workload and scheduling norms of the era. 8 minutes. In those 8 minutes, a physician would take a brief history, do whatever examination the situation called for, assess the patient's overall presentation, and reach a prescribing decision. For a weight management appointment, the encounter had a particular structure that many thousands of women experienced in closely similar ways. You were weighed on the way in by the nurse, on a scale in the hallway outside the examination room. The number was written on a card and left on the doctor's desk. When the doctor came in, he looked at the card before he looked at you. This detail was noticed by women who experienced it, the number preceding the person, the measurement preceding the encounter. The doctor compared the number to your previous number, and to the number that the insurance table said was appropriate for your height. If you were above the appropriate number, this was discussed. It was always discussed. The discussion was often brief, a notation of the deficit a target provided, sometimes a dietary recommendation that was itself brief, perhaps a referral to a pamphlet. And then, in many cases, the prescription. The conversation about what dexedrine was did not usually happen in 1963 in the way a conversation about medication mechanism might happen now. The patient did not receive an explanation of amphetamine pharmacology. She received a diagnosis, overweight or obese depending on how far from the insurance table number she sat, and a prescription for its treatment. The prescription was for a duration, 30 days, sometimes 60, renewable upon return. The conversation that did not happen in those 8 minutes is the one this chapter is about. Nobody said, this drug belongs to a class called amphetamines. It is a stimulant. Military forces used it in large quantities during World War II to keep soldiers alert. It is related to a street drug called benzedrine that is currently being taken recreationally by people who break open the inhalers and eat the papers inside. It can produce a state of dependence in which the absence of the drug is experienced as worse than the state it was meant to treat. We do not know very well what happens in patients who take it continuously for more than a year, because we have not studied that population carefully. We think it is probably fine. We hope it is probably fine. Nobody said any of that. Not because they were dishonest, but because much of it was not yet understood, and the parts that were understood were not yet organized into a narrative that physicians were telling their patients, and the culture of the 1963 doctor-patient relationship was not one in which the 8 minutes included that kind of extended informed consent conversation. The concept of informed consent as a formal medical and legal framework was still developing in 1963. It existed in law, or the foundational cases establishing a patient's right to information before consenting to treatment date from the early 20th century, but in practice, the physician's authority to make treatment decisions largely without extended patient consultation was still the norm. Patients trusted doctors. Doctors were trusted. This was the appropriate order of things, and the information asymmetry it implied was not experienced as a problem by most participants in the system. So the conversation ran its 8 minutes. The prescription was written. The appointment concluded. The patient collected her prescription from the pharmacy, brought it home, put it on the kitchen counter, and began taking it according to the instructions on the bottle. The instructions on the bottle did not say anything about dependence. They said when to take it and how much. Parallel to the individual consultation, there were regulatory structures that were also not having the conversation that would later be recognized as necessary. The FDA in 1963 was operating under rules that had been shaped by the thalidomide crisis of the early 1960s, the tranquilizer that caused limb defects in thousands of babies across Europe, and whose exclusion from the US market was one of the FDA's defining moments. The thalidomide crisis had galvanized demand for better pre-market testing, and had produced the Kefauver-Harris Amendment of 1962, which strengthened the FDA's authority to demand evidence of both safety and efficacy before a drug could be approved. But dexedrine was already on the market. It had been approved before the new standards, and the question of what to do about drugs that were widely prescribed and commercially important, but whose long-term effects were insufficiently studied, was not one the regulatory system had a clear procedure for handling in 1963. There was also the prescribing information, the official document provided to physicians with each drug, describing its indications, dosage, contraindications, and known side effects. The prescribing information for dexedrine in the early 1960s did mention, in language carefully chosen to be accurate without being alarming, the possibility of psychological dependence. It advised caution. It recommended that the drug be prescribed for limited periods and that patients be monitored. This information existed. It was in the document that accompanied the drug. Most physicians did not read prescribing information in the way that regulatory intent imagined they would. The detail men who visited their offices provided summaries. The summaries emphasized efficacy. The caveats were present but quiet, as caveats in pharmaceutical literature tend to be. And so the gap between what the prescribing information contained and what the consultation room said was substantial. The information that might have changed the calculus for individual patients, information about dependence, about what stopping the drug would feel like, about the limits of the clinical trial data, was technically available in the system, but not practically transmitted to the women making the decision to take the drug. By 1965, the conversations that had not happened in individual consultation rooms were beginning to happen at a regulatory level. Senator Thomas Dodd of Connecticut held hearings on the amphetamine problem in 1965, and the testimony that emerged described a drug distribution system that had become significantly broader than any therapeutic rationale could justify. Manufacturers were producing amphetamines in quantities far exceeding the population of patients for whom the drug had legitimate uses. The excess was finding its way through various channels into non-medical use. The hearings produced concern. They produced some tightening of distribution. They did not produce a fundamental reassessment of the therapeutic use of amphetamines in the weight management context, partly because that reassessment would require challenging a practice that was deeply embedded in medical culture and enormously economically significant. The reassessment would come, but it would come slowly, in the way that reassessments come when the thing being reassessed is large enough and profitable enough that the system has significant reasons to delay understanding it. Meanwhile, in kitchens across suburban America, the orange bottles were on the counters, and the mornings were manageable, and the conversations that would have changed things were the conversations nobody was having. 8 minutes was not very long. It was long enough to write a prescription. It was not long enough for much else. And the gap between those two statements, everything that could have been said in the time between writing the prescription and saying nothing at all, is in a sense the subject of this entire chapter. The prescription pad scratched. The appointment ended. Somewhere, a woman was putting on her coat in a waiting room, folding her prescription into her purse, heading for the pharmacy. The parking lot was bright. The errands were not finished. The afternoon was waiting. Everything was ordinary. The consultation room in 1963 was designed to facilitate a particular kind of authority. The physician's desk was large. The physician sat behind it. The patient sat in front of it, literally on the other side of the desk in a chair that was lower and smaller, and positioned to communicate the relationship clearly. The white coat was not required in the consultation room in the way it was in the hospital ward, but the overall architecture of the space communicated the same message. The physician knows and the patient receives. This architecture of authority had advantages. Patients who trusted their physicians followed their treatment plans more reliably. The authority of the physician's recommendation was part of the therapeutic effect of many treatments. A placebo prescribed with authority by a trusted physician worked better than the same placebo prescribed with doubt. The architecture served medicine, in the broad sense, and it served it genuinely. It also served the particular structure of the 8-minute appointment in ways that did not serve patients as well. The authority that short-circuited questioning also short-circuited disclosure. A woman who had concerns about her prescription, who felt strange when she missed a dose, who had noticed something that worried her, was in a room designed to receive information rather than exchange it, at an appointment designed to produce a prescription rather than a conversation. The structural incentives were against the conversation that might have changed the outcome. The prescribing information document, the official package insert in modern terminology, was not a patient document. It was a physician document. It was written in technical language. It was not given to the patient. The patient received a small bottle with a label that said how many to take and when, and possibly a brief verbal summary from the pharmacist, and that was the extent of the pharmaceutical education available to her at the point of filling the prescription. In 1962, the FDA began requiring that prescribing information include, in a standard format, information about indications, contraindications, adverse reactions, and dosage. This was a significant improvement in the quality of information available to prescribers. It was not accompanied by any requirement that this information be made accessible to patients in plain language. The patient remained, structurally, the recipient of a treatment decision rather than a participant in it. The patient rights movement, the development of formal patient rights, including the right to informed consent in a meaningful rather than a merely technical sense, was a product of the late 1960s and 1970s. It emerged partly from the civil rights movement, which had established the principle that institutional authority was not self-legitimating. It emerged partly from the women's health movement, which produced in 1970 the book Our Bodies, Ourselves, a collective project by a group of Boston women who had become frustrated with the quality of medical information available to them and had decided to produce their own. The book addressed anatomy, sexuality, birth control, pregnancy, and a range of other topics in language written specifically for women without medical training, explicitly as an act of epistemic empowerment. Our Bodies Ourselves was in its way a document about the gap described in this chapter, the gap between what the medical system knew and what it chose to communicate to the women it was treating. The book said, in effect, you have a right to this information. Here it is. The consultations that hadn't happened could, in some degree, be replaced by the information now available in a paperback. But Our Bodies, Ourselves, was published in 1970, and the dexedrine prescriptions had been running since the early 1950s. The gap it addressed had been operating for nearly 20 years. The learning it represented was built from those 20 years of women experiencing individually and without systemic support the consequences of the consultation that had not happened. The clock in the consultation room ran 8 minutes. The 8 minutes produced a prescription. The prescription produced years of experience that the 8 minutes had not prepared anyone for. And the gap between those two things, the 8 minutes and the years, is the space in which this whole story lives. It is worth sitting with that gap for a moment, here in the quiet, not with anger, which is a waking hour's emotion, and which this hour does not need, but with the particular sadness of understanding something that cannot be changed. The consultations were not going to be longer. The system was not going to be redesigned. The women were going to go home with their prescriptions and their small orange bottles and their entirely reasonable hope that this was what help looked like. It was a kind of help, and it had a cost. Both things are true. Both have always been true. The space between them is where the women lived. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. The end of an era in pharmaceutical history does not arrive the way it arrives in dramatic narratives. There is no single moment, no announcement, no obvious turning point visible to everyone at once. The end arrives in accumulations. A study here, a hearing there, a regulatory shift, a change in the language of the prescribing information, a slow reorientation in medical culture that takes years to work its way down from the journals to the consultation rooms to the individual prescription pads of individual physicians in individual suburbs. The amphetamine era ended, the first era, the housewife era, the dexedrine era, in stages across the late 1960s and early 1970s, and the stages are worth tracing because they are characteristic of how this kind of ending happens. The first stage was the countercultural problem. Amphetamine had become a significant drug of abuse in the late 1960s, particularly among young people for whom it was available through non-medical channels. Speed, injected methamphetamine, was part of the drug culture in a way that put it in the same cultural space as LSD and heroin, and the proximity of legitimate prescription dexedrine to this street-level phenomenon was uncomfortable. The association was not pharmacologically very important. The doses and methods of use were very different, but it was culturally damaging. Drugs were drugs, and drugs were becoming a social problem, and dexedrine was a drug, and the category contamination was significant. The 1970 Controlled Substances Act reorganized American drug law entirely. It created the scheduling system, Schedule 1 through Schedule 5, that classified drugs by their accepted medical use and potential for abuse. Amphetamines were placed in Schedule 2, the category for drugs with accepted medical uses but high potential for abuse. Schedule 2 classification did not ban the drugs, but it introduced regulatory requirements. Triplicate prescriptions, stricter dispensing rules, prescriber registration that made the casual, renewable 30-day-at-a-time prescribing of the 1960s significantly harder to maintain. The practical effect on prescription rates was substantial. Amphetamine prescriptions in the United States dropped significantly through the early 1970s as the regulatory friction increased and the cultural climate around the drug shifted. Physicians who had been prescribing freely and routinely began pulling back, partly because the paperwork was more onerous, and partly because the cultural signal was clear. Amphetamines were now officially drugs, in the sense that cocaine was a drug and heroin was a drug, and that association changed the risk calculation in the minds of prescribers who had previously thought of dexedrine as simply a useful medication. This is the regulatory moment. But the regulatory moment is not the same as the moment when women who had been taking dexedrine for years were told what was happening or what to do about it. That conversation for many women also did not happen. The prescriptions simply became harder to get. The doctor who had been renewing the prescription without much comment for several years mentioned at some point that things were changing, that the prescription would need to taper, that perhaps alternative approaches should be considered. The alternative approaches were diet and exercise. The same diet and exercise that had been inadequate a decade earlier, before the medication, and that were now reassigned as the appropriate medical response. For women who had been taking amphetamines long-term, the discontinuation of the prescription was not a neutral event. The dependence that had developed over years of continuous use, physical, psychological and behavioural, the body and mind organised around the presence of the drug, did not resolve itself simply because the prescription had run out. The physical withdrawal from long-term amphetamine use includes a period of profound fatigue, significantly increased appetite, depressed mood that can be severe, and a kind of mental flatness that makes ordinary tasks feel enormous. Amphetamine withdrawal was not well described in the medical literature of the early 1970s. It was not dramatic in the way that heroin withdrawal was dramatic. There were no obvious physical symptoms of the kind that made opiate withdrawal legible and urgent. What it produced was a quality of difficulty that was private and internal, the feeling of being unable to cope, the return of appetite and weight gain, the depression that settled in and was hard to shift. These symptoms were real. They had a pharmacological cause. They were experienced by very many women in very similar ways. They were processed, often, as personal failure, not as the predictable consequence of discontinuing a dependency-producing substance, but as evidence that the underlying problem, the weight, the low energy, the difficulty managing, had simply returned. Women blamed themselves. This is one of the most consistent findings in historical accounts of this period. The pharmacological experience was translated by the women experiencing it and by many of the physicians treating them into a narrative about the woman's character and capability rather than into a narrative about the drug's effects. There was no equivalent of the modern opioid crisis narrative. The systemic analysis, the public conversation about how pharmaceutical dependency was produced and by whom, the recognition that patients were not simply making bad choices, but were responding to a pharmacological reality for which the medical system bore significant responsibility. That framing did not exist for amphetamine dependence in 1972. It would take another 40 years before the opioid crisis would finally establish, in public consciousness, the template for understanding pharmaceutical dependency as a systemic rather than a personal problem. In 1972, the personal narrative was the one available. Women who were struggling after their prescriptions stopped were struggling quietly, individually, and mostly without support. Some developed patterns of continued use through other channels, obtaining amphetamines through less formal means, taking products containing related stimulants that were still available without prescription, substituting other substances. These adaptations were themselves sources of difficulty, but they were largely invisible in the absence of any systematic tracking. The pharmaceutical companies that had manufactured the drugs were not especially visible in this process. Smith, Klein, and French did not produce public education materials about discontinuation. There were no clinic programs designed to support women coming off long-term prescription amphetamines. The medical system that had initiated millions of prescriptions did not develop a corresponding infrastructure for managing the end of those prescriptions. This was not unusual. It was simply characteristic of how pharmaceutical eras ended, and of how little the architecture of medicine in 1972 attended to what happened after the prescription stopped. Somewhere in 1973, in a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, or Sacramento, California, or Hartford, Connecticut, a woman was throwing away the last of the orange bottles. She had stopped trying to get refills. The doctor had not been helpful. The weight had come back. She was tired in a way she recognized from before the prescription began, except perhaps a little more so. She did not know that millions of other women were having some version of the same experience in the same years. She did not know that what she was experiencing had a pharmacological explanation. She did not know that the industry that had prescribed to her for a decade was already pivoting, that the next era of weight loss pharmacology was already in development, that other compounds were already in trials, that the cycle was already preparing to turn. She only knew that the mornings were harder now, and that she was heavier than she had been before the prescription, and that she was going to have to figure out what to do about that. She would figure it out. Women always did. This is one of the quiet themes of this whole long story: how adaptable, how resilient, how persistently capable women were in circumstances the system had consistently failed to prepare them for. And outside, the 1970s were getting started, a different decade, a different culture, but the same essential weight of the body as a problem to be solved, and the same fundamental conviction, somewhere in the industry that served that conviction, that the next solution was probably just around the corner. The 1970 Controlled Substances Act was part of a broader reorganization of American drug law that reflected the cultural upheaval of the late 1960s. The scheduling system it created was intended to bring rational order to a drug landscape that had become, in the view of the Nixon administration and much of Congress, chaotic and dangerous. The concern was primarily about recreational drug use, LSD, heroin, the counterculture's embrace of chemical experience, and the scheduling system was designed to address that concern. The effect on the therapeutic prescribing of amphetamines was real but partially unintended. The Schedule II classification for amphetamines had been set based on their recreational abuse potential, which was real, but the impact on therapeutic prescribing fell primarily on the population who had been using them therapeutically, who were largely not the same population as the recreational users. The regulatory response to the countercultural drug problem partly dismantled the pharmaceutical infrastructure that had been serving millions of women who had not been using the drugs recreationally at all. This is a recurring structural feature of drug regulation in the American context. The regulatory tools are designed around categories of use and user that do not map cleanly onto the full population affected. The Schedule II classification made sense in the context of recreational abuse prevention. It was a blunt instrument for the context of long-term therapeutic dependency in women who had been legitimately prescribed the drugs for years. The two populations needed different regulatory responses. They got the same one. The women who lost their prescriptions in the early 1970s were not adequately supported through the transition because the medical system did not have a framework for what they were going through. Amphetamine discontinuation syndrome was not a recognized clinical entity in the way that, say, opiate withdrawal syndrome was. The physical symptoms of opiate withdrawal, the sweat, the tremor, the physical agony, were dramatic and unmistakable and had been studied extensively. The symptoms of amphetamine discontinuation, the profound fatigue, the increased appetite, the depression, the cognitive slowing, were less dramatic and more internal and much easier to attribute to something other than withdrawal. Many women attributed their difficulties to themselves. This is what happens when the medical system doesn't provide a framework for understanding an experience. People develop their own frameworks, and the frameworks they develop are shaped by the cultural materials available to them. In 1972, the cultural materials available to a woman struggling after stopping her Dexedrine included a strong cultural narrative about women's emotional fragility, inadequacy, and tendency to collapse without external support. The framework she was most likely to reach for, in the absence of any medical alternative, was one that blamed her. The weight gain that followed discontinuation was particularly significant in this context. Women who had been taking amphetamines for years and had maintained reduced weights on the drug often regained weight rapidly when they stopped, sometimes exceeding their pre-prescription weight due to metabolic changes associated with long-term stimulant use. This weight gain was then processed by their physicians and by themselves through the same cultural lens that had sent them to the doctor in the first place. Here was evidence that the problem was real and that the solution, however imperfect, had been working. Some women went back on the medication. Some managed the discontinuation and carried the weight. Some developed other patterns of pharmaceutical management. The diet pills of the 1970s and 1980s were often prescribed to exactly this population. The The continuity between the Dexedrine era and the rainbow pill era and the fen-phen era is not just structural. In many cases, it is literally the same women moving through successive pharmaceutical eras, each time carrying the accumulated weight of what the previous era had done to their bodies and their understanding of their bodies. The 1970s also saw the development of a new cultural conversation about women's health that would, eventually, produce frameworks adequate to understanding what the Dexedrine generation had been through. The women's health movement, our bodies, ourselves, the feminist health clinics, the emerging academic field of women's health research, began producing the vocabulary and the institutional infrastructure that made women's pharmaceutical experiences legible as a political and medical problem rather than a personal failing. But this conversation took time to develop and more time to reach the women who needed it. The 1973 woman throwing away her last orange bottle was largely outside the reach of these emerging frameworks. She was in the gap between the old system and the new one, and the gap was wide and cold and not especially well lit. She would navigate it, as the women in this story always navigated what the system produced and then abandoned them in, with the quiet competence of people who have learned not to expect that anyone else is going to sort out the mess. The rainbow pills. In the years between the end of the Dexedrine era and the arrival of what would become the next great pharmaceutical weight loss catastrophe, the industry did not stand still. It is worth spending some time in this transitional period, the 1970s and 1980s, because it illustrates something important about how the cycle sustains itself between its peak moments. When the main door closes, when a drug is regulated into inaccessibility or withdrawn from the market, the weight loss industry finds the side windows. It finds the products that are technically legal, technically different from the condemned thing, technically positioned as something new, and it finds the practitioners who are willing to work at the edges of what the regulatory system has prohibited and what it has not yet gotten around to addressing. The rainbow pills were perhaps the most vivid illustration of this adaptation, and they deserve a chapter of their own. The rainbow pills were not a single product but an entire category of compounded preparations, medications mixed by individual pharmacies or prescribed by individual physicians working outside the mainstream of pharmaceutical regulation. They were called rainbow pills because they came in multiple colours, each colour representing a different component in a multi-drug cocktail. A typical rainbow pill prescription in the 1970s might include a stimulant, sometimes an amphetamine derivative, sometimes something adjacent, combined with a diuretic, sometimes a thyroid hormone, sometimes a barbiturate or tranquilizer to counteract the stimulant's edge. This combination approach had a certain logic, if you were willing to follow it down a particular path. The stimulant suppressed appetite and raised energy. The diuretic produced immediate weight loss through water reduction, which showed up pleasingly on the scale. The thyroid hormone added metabolic stimulation. The tranquilizer managed the anxiety and insomnia that the stimulant could produce. A woman taking all four was in effect taking a pharmaceutical cocktail that addressed the weight from multiple angles simultaneously. What she was also doing, though this was not how it was presented, was taking a combination of drugs whose interactions had not been specifically studied, prescribed by physicians whose primary qualifications for prescribing this particular combination were their willingness to do so, in the context of weight loss clinics that had sprung up specifically to serve this market. The weight loss clinic as a commercial entity, a medical practice devoted primarily to weight management and positioned specifically as a source of prescription weight loss treatments, became a significant industry presence in the 1970s. These were not always fly-by-night operations. Some were run by board-certified physicians who genuinely believed in their protocols. Others were less rigorous. The range was wide, and the regulatory environment for what happened inside a licensed physician's office was limited enough that the range could be maintained. Women who visited weight loss clinics in the 1970s were processed through a system designed to produce prescription in the most efficient way possible. Weight was measured, height was measured. The gap between the measurement and the insurance table ideal was established. A prescription was written. In the better clinics, dietary advice accompanied the prescription. In the less good ones, the prescription was the primary product. The rainbow pills produced weight loss, at least initially. This was not surprising given what was in them. What they also produced over time was a range of adverse effects, not always individually dramatic, but accumulated in the women who were taking the cocktails, the heart irregularities from long-term stimulant use, the electrolyte disruption from chronic diuretic use, the thyroid dysregulation from hormonal supplementation. These effects were real, and they were being experienced by real women, and they were being reported back to individual practitioners in individual practices across the country. The aggregate picture, what was happening to the population of women taking rainbow pill preparations, was not being collected systematically. This was before the era of comprehensive adverse event reporting. The FDA's pharmacovigilance systems were not yet designed to pick up the distributed signal of harm across millions of individual patients. By the early 1980s, regulatory pressure was building against the most problematic preparations. State medical boards began acting against practitioners whose rainbow pill prescribing was generating visible harm. The DEA pursued cases involving amphetamine derivatives being prescribed outside the bounds of legitimate medical practice. The most egregious weight loss clinics were shut down. The practices that had been most clearly outside the regulatory lines were constrained. But the underlying demand, the millions of women who wanted pharmaceutical help with their weight, and who were working in a culture that evaluated them relentlessly on the basis of their bodies, did not disappear when the rainbow pill clinics were constrained. It was simply waiting for the next vehicle. The cycle was in the phase between peaks, accumulating pressure, preparing for the next solution. That solution was being developed in pharmaceutical laboratories during exactly these years. Fenfluramine, a drug that had been available in Europe since the 1960s, reached the US market in 1973 and was quietly prescribed for obesity through the 1970s and 1980s without generating enormous attention. Phentermine, a stimulant in the amphetamine family but placed in Schedule 4 rather than Schedule 2, indicating lower abuse potential, was also available. Both drugs were used individually with modest results. In 1992, an endocrinologist at Cornell named Michael Weintraub published the results of a 4-year study in which he had combined fenfluramine and phentermine, calling the combination fen-phen, and found that the combination produced substantially greater weight loss than either drug alone. The results were published in a respected journal. They were carefully described as a study in a specific patient population over a specific time period. They were a proper scientific finding. And then the finding was processed by the medical and commercial system in the way that promising findings in the weight loss space get processed, which is to say, very rapidly, very broadly, and with a great deal of enthusiasm about the efficacy and a great deal of quietness about the limits of what the study actually showed. By 1996, approximately 18 million prescriptions for fen-phen were being written annually in the United States. The combination had not been specifically approved by the FDA as a combination. It was being prescribed as 2 drugs used together, each individually approved, which was technically legal and which allowed the combination to circumvent the review process that would have applied to a specifically approved combination product. The regulatory gap was real, and it was being exploited not through malice but through the entirely natural tendency of a medical and commercial system to move quickly towards something that appeared to work. The weight loss clinics, which had been constrained in the rainbow pill era, reopened under the banner of the new therapy. The detail men of a new generation visited physicians' offices with their literature. The prescriptions were written. The women came in hoping. They always came in hoping. This is the thing that is hardest to sit with, in the long perspective of the cycle, not the commercial calculation of the industry, which is predictable and at least transparent in its logic, but the hope itself, the genuine, entirely reasonable hope of women who had been told for generations that their bodies were a problem and who were doing the sensible thing, the medically endorsed thing, the thing their doctors recommended. The hope was not naive, it was simply inside the cycle. From inside the cycle, you can only see the hope. You cannot see where it ends. The 1970s and 1980s were, for the weight loss industry, a period of creative adaptation. The main door had been closed. The casual, renewable dexedrine prescription of the 1960s was no longer available, but the demand remained entirely unchanged. The women who had organized their lives around pharmaceutical weight management did not, with the regulatory change, simply become content with their bodies. They went looking, quite reasonably, for the next available tool. The over-the-counter stimulant market of the 1970s was a significant phenomenon that receives less historical attention than the prescription drug eras on either side of it. When the Schedule II restrictions made prescription amphetamines harder to obtain, pharmaceutical companies reformulated related compounds into products that could be sold without a prescription. Phenylpropanolamine, a stimulant less potent than amphetamine but pharmacologically similar in its mechanisms, became the active ingredient in a range of OTC diet products. Dexatrim, introduced in 1976, was the most commercially successful of these, and it was advertised heavily to exactly the population that had recently lost access to prescription amphetamines. Phenylpropanolamine was sold in OTC diet products for more than 20 years. It was withdrawn from the market in 2000 after studies showed a significant association with hemorrhagic stroke, bleeding in the brain, particularly in women. The FDA asked manufacturers to withdraw it voluntarily, and they did. The withdrawal affected millions of women who had been using the products without any indication from the packaging or their healthcare providers that there was a stroke risk. 20-plus years of OTC availability, withdrawn for cardiovascular harm, a large number of women affected with limited systematic tracking of outcomes. The pattern is by now familiar. The names change, the mechanism changes, the commercial vehicle changes from prescription to over-the-counter. The structure of the cycle does not change. The weight loss clinic phenomenon of the 1970s and 1980s is worth examining in some detail because it represents the emergence of a form of medical entrepreneurship that would become increasingly significant in subsequent decades. The weight loss clinic occupied an interesting regulatory space. It was a medical practice, subject to medical licensing requirements, but it was organized around the commercial production of weight loss rather than around the broader provision of medical care. The distinction mattered. A general practice physician prescribing a weight loss medication was embedded in a clinical relationship with a patient over time, a relationship that included knowledge of the patient's history, other conditions, and overall health. The weight loss clinic was a specialized service delivery vehicle. The physician in the weight loss clinic often saw patients for a single purpose, had limited information about their other health conditions, and was operating under commercial incentives that rewarded prescribing and patient throughput. This is not to say all weight loss clinics were irresponsible. Many provided genuine and thoughtful medical support, but the structure created conditions in which prescribing decisions were made with less information and under different incentive structures than those of the general practice setting, and these conditions produced at the population level patterns of prescribing that a more cautious system would not have produced. The rainbow pill era, which flourished particularly in the late 1970s and early 1980s, was partly a product of this clinic structure. The compounding pharmacy, a pharmacy that mixed medications to order rather than dispensing standardized manufactured products, existed in a regulatory space with less oversight than the mainstream pharmaceutical market. Physicians who worked with compounding pharmacies could develop proprietary formulations that were not subject to the FDA approval process that applied to manufactured drugs, because the FDA's authority over compounded preparations was at the time limited. This regulatory gap was real, intentional. Compounding had a legitimate role in producing medications for patients with specific needs not met by standardized products, and exploited. The rainbow pill clinics operated in this gap, producing multi-drug cocktails that no FDA review process had evaluated, and that no systematic safety research had characterized. The drugs worked, in their way. The complications were real. The patients who experienced them had limited recourse. By the mid-1980s, regulatory attention was closing the rainbow pill clinic gap. State medical boards acted against the most egregious practitioners. The DEA pursued the stimulant components. The clinics that had been operating at the fringes of legality were shut down or modified, but the fundamental demand remained untouched, and by 1992, when Michael Weintraub published his Fen-Phen study in a respectable peer-reviewed journal, the industry was ready for something it could use in the mainstream again. The signal arrived from Minnesota. In early 1997, a cardiologist at the Mayo Clinic named Heidi Connolly was examining patients who had been referred with unusual heart murmurs. The murmurs were not individually extremely alarming. Heart murmurs are common, and most are benign. But the pattern was. The patients presenting with these murmurs shared something. They had been taking Fen-Phen. Connolly and her colleagues examined 24 women who'd been taking the combination and found that an unusual proportion of them, a proportion far higher than population baselines would predict, had abnormalities in their heart valves. Specifically, they had thickened, leaky valves in a pattern that resembled the cardiac damage produced by carcinoid tumours, a rare condition in which serotonin-secreting tumours produce characteristic valve pathology. Fen-phen was not a carcinoid tumour, but it had the relevant pharmacological property. Fenfluramine acted on serotonin pathways, and serotonin, it turned out, had a role in valve cell proliferation that nobody had specifically studied in the context of fenfluramine administration. The Mayo Clinic reported its findings to the FDA in July 1997. The findings were preliminary, based on a small series, and the researchers were careful in their language. But the signal was clear enough that the FDA took immediate action. In September 1997, the FDA requested that with Hearst Laboratories, the manufacturer of Redux, a reformulation of fenfluramine, and American Home Products, which made Pondamin, the original fenfluramine, voluntarily withdraw their drugs from the market. Both companies complied. Fentamin, which had not been implicated in the cardiac findings, remained on the market, though its most common use, the fen-phen combination, was now impossible. The withdrawal was significant but not instantaneous in its effects. Women who had been taking the combination received letters from their physicians advising them to stop and to have a cardiac evaluation. The cardiac evaluations revealed a sobering picture. Later, larger studies estimated that somewhere between 30% and 50% of patients who had been on long-term fen-phen therapy had some degree of cardiac valve abnormality. The severity ranged from mild and likely inconsequential to conditions requiring surgery. The legal consequences were enormous. American Home Products, which had been the primary manufacturer of the fenfluramine component, faced litigation from patients across the country. The eventual settlement, reached over several years of proceedings, was reported to be in excess of $21 billion, one of the largest pharmaceutical settlements in American history to that point. The lawsuits produced extensive discovery, internal documents, memos, communications among company executives and researchers, that told a particular story about what had been known and when and by whom. The documents revealed that concerns about cardiac effects had been raised in European medical literature before the American boom. Fenfluramine had been available in France and other European countries since the 1960s, and there was a body of European research on the drug that included some cardiac observations. Whether those observations were sufficient to establish the link that the Mayo Clinic would establish in 1997 is a question that the litigation grappled with at length. What the documents established was that the signals were available to be seen, that they were not systematically pursued, and that the commercial success of the product created pressures that were not conducive to aggressive investigation of potential harms. This is a familiar structure, not unique to fen-phen, not unique to weight loss drugs. It is the structure of how pharmaceutical harm tends to accumulate. A small signal in the literature, not adequately pursued, a commercial context that incentivizes speed over caution, a regulatory system that acts on what it can see, which is what is reported to it, which is shaped by who is doing the reporting and what they are incentivized to report. The women at the center of the fen-phen story are worth keeping in mind through all this regulatory and commercial analysis. They were women who had gone to their doctors with a weight problem, a real problem in many cases with real health consequences, because the connection between obesity and conditions like type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and cardiovascular disease is real and well established. They had been given a pharmaceutical solution that, from the available evidence at the time of prescribing, appeared to be effective and adequately safe. They had taken it as directed. They had lost weight in many cases significantly. And then they had been told that the drug they had taken for months or years had altered the structure of their hearts. Some of them required surgery, some had lasting symptoms. Many lived with cardiac monitoring for years, the uncertainty of not knowing whether the valvular abnormality they had would progress or stabilize or resolve. They had entered a medical system seeking help with their weight, and had left it with a cardiac condition. This is not a story about recklessness or bad faith in the main. It is a story about the gap between what the system knew and what the system communicated, between the precautionary principle that safety should be established before wide adoption, and the commercial and medical reality that wide adoption preceded the kind of large-scale long-term evidence that would have revealed the problem earlier. The fen-phen withdrawal did not end the weight loss drug era. It created a gap, and into that gap poured a product from a Swiss pharmaceutical company called Novartis, sibutramine, marketed as Meridia, which was approved by the FDA in 1997, the same year fen-phen was withdrawn, and which was positioned as a safer alternative. Meridia was a different mechanism, affecting different neurotransmitters. It also eventually produced its own cardiovascular concerns, and was withdrawn from the US market in 2010 after a study showed increased rates of heart attack and stroke in patients with pre-existing cardiovascular disease. Approved 1997, withdrawn 2010, 13 years. The interval is worth noting, not because 13 years is unusually short for a pharmaceutical product's career, it is not, but because the pattern it describes is so consistent with every other product in this story. Approval, adoption, the accumulating signal, the study that cannot be ignored, the withdrawal, the gap, the next product. The cycle does not stop. It does not need to stop. There is always another product in development, another mechanism being explored, another combination being tested. The demand is inexhaustible because the demand is produced by a culture that has decided, with great consistency for over a century, that a woman's weight is a medical problem requiring pharmaceutical solution. And in 1997, while the fen-phen lawsuits were being filed and the cardiac evaluations were being scheduled in a laboratory somewhere in Denmark, a class of drugs was being studied that would, in 20 years, change the weight loss landscape more profoundly than anything since the amphetamine era. They were being studied at that point for type 2 diabetes. Weight loss was a side effect. Nobody had yet decided to make it the primary selling point. That decision was still some years away. But the cycle was patient, the cycle was always patient. The legal aftermath of fen-phen produced, among other things, an extensive public record of the internal communications of American Home Products, the manufacturer of Pondamin, during the years when the cardiac signal was developing. These documents became public through the discovery process in the litigation, and were eventually the basis for detailed journalistic and academic analysis of how the company had handled the emerging evidence. What the documents revealed was not a conspiracy of suppression, but something more nuanced and perhaps more troubling. A series of decisions, each individually defensible, that collectively produced a pattern of insufficient action on concerning signals. A study was received and characterized as preliminary. A signal was noted and described as requiring further investigation. A regulatory filing was made in a form that disclosed without foregrounding. The communications showed people who knew, at varying levels of specificity, that there were questions to be asked, making decisions about the urgency and manner of asking them that were influenced, at every level, by the commercial reality of a very valuable product. The litigation also revealed something about the population of women who had been prescribed fen-phen that was not immediately visible in the aggregate prescribing data. They were not a narrow clinical population of severely obese patients, for whom the cardiovascular and metabolic risks of obesity genuinely outweighed the risks of pharmaceutical treatment. They were a broad population, including many women who were only modestly overweight by clinical criteria, who had been prescribed the combination because it was available and because their physicians had concluded that weight loss would benefit them. The expansion of the prescribing population, from the clinical cases where the risk-benefit calculus clearly favoured treatment to the broad market, where it was much less clear, was a characteristic of the fen-phen boom that made the eventual harm larger than it might otherwise have been. Every pharmaceutical product's harm potential expands as the prescribing population expands, because the broader population includes people for whom the drug's risks are higher and its benefits lower. The regulatory approval for a narrowly defined indication, when translated into broad market adoption, is not always a safe translation. The FDA's response to the fen-phen cardiac findings was rapid by the standards of pharmaceutical regulation. The drug was withdrawn within months of the Mayo Clinic report. But the aftermath, the cardiac evaluations, the determination of harm, the structuring of the settlement, took years. And during those years, the women who had been prescribed the combination continued to live with the uncertainty of not knowing whether the valve abnormalities that had been found in some of them would progress, stabilize, or resolve. Many of them remained in cardiac monitoring programs for years beyond the withdrawal. Some required surgery. The particular quality of that uncertainty is worth pausing on. These were women who had gone to their doctors for a weight problem. They had taken a medication that their doctors had prescribed. They had lost weight, which they had been told was healthier, and then they had been told that the medication had potentially altered the structure of their hearts. The uncertainty about the long-term consequences of that alteration, would the valve worsen? Would symptoms develop? Was not resolved quickly. It lived in their bodies as an ongoing question, a reminder that the solution they had been offered had come with a cost that was measured in a currency they had not known they were spending. The settlement that American Home Products eventually reached, reported at the time to involve more than $21 billion in payments across the various litigation proceedings, was one of the largest pharmaceutical settlements in history. It compensated some of the women who had been harmed. It did not compensate for the uncertainty, the ongoing medical monitoring, the years of not knowing. Compensation operates in the language of the legal system and the financial system. The experience of living in a body that has been changed by a pharmaceutical decision made in a brief consultation, that experience operates in a different register, one that the settlement language does not quite reach. Wyeth, American Home Products had changed its name, established a settlement fund in 1999 that processed claims for many years. The fund had eligibility criteria, review processes, payment schedules. It was an enormous administrative undertaking. It was ultimately a way of translating physical harm into financial terms, and the translation was imperfect in the way that all such translations are imperfect. The women who navigated the settlement claims process were, again, mostly navigating it alone, without the kind of community support structures that later mass harm cases sometimes produced. They knew, in most cases, only their own experience, their own consultation, their own prescription, their own cardiac evaluation. The connection to the larger pattern, the understanding that what had happened to them was not an individual misfortune but a systemic outcome, was available in the media coverage but not always experienced as personally real. The media coverage of Fen-Phen was substantial and serious, and it produced a public understanding of the drug's harms that was more immediate and more broadly shared than had been the case with the Dexedrine era. Part of this was the changed media environment, 24-hour cable news, the early internet, a more adversarial and investigative press culture. Part of it was the nature of the harm. Cardiac valve abnormalities were measurable, objective, and producible in court. The harm was visible in a way that psychological dependency had not been. The Fen-Phen story is the clearest case in this 120-year history where the cycle's mechanisms were most publicly illuminated, where the commercial decision-making, the regulatory gap, the expanded prescribing and the resulting harm were examined in detail in public with consequences. It did not stop the cycle. The cycle turned, as it always did, to the next solution, but Fen-Phen at least established that such an examination was possible and that it could produce consequences. That is not nothing. In the long history of the cycle, the Fen-Phen reckoning is, if not a turning point, at least a moment of genuine public clarity. In the years between Fen-Phen's fall and Ozempic's rise, the weight loss industry turned in part away from chemistry and towards surgery. If the pharmaceutical approach kept producing problems, if the drugs kept damaging hearts, raising blood pressure, producing dependencies, perhaps the problem lay not in finding the right drug but in recognizing that the body itself was the site to be modified. Not changed temporarily through a pill, but restructured permanently through surgical intervention. This is a different philosophy, and it is worth examining as such, because it represents a significant escalation in the cultural logic that underlies the entire 120-year story. The tapeworm pill asked a woman to swallow something. The Dexedrine prescription asked her to take something daily. Fen-Phen asked her to take 2 things daily, but bariatric surgery asked her to permanently alter the anatomy of her digestive system, to accept an irreversible change to her body in order to change the relationship between that body and food. Bariatric surgery, surgical interventions designed to produce weight loss by modifying the stomach, the intestines, or both, had existed in various forms since the 1950s. The first jejunal bypass surgery was performed in 1954, connecting a short segment of functional small intestine to the colon and bypassing the rest, producing malabsorption on a dramatic scale. This operation was effective for weight loss and catastrophic for overall health. The malabsorption was so severe and so non-selective that patients suffered from liver failure, kidney stones, and metabolic disorders in rates that led to the operation's abandonment by the 1980s. The gastric bypass, which became the dominant form of bariatric surgery from the 1970s onward, was substantially safer. By routing food directly from a small pouch of stomach to the small intestine, it reduced both stomach capacity and absorption surface in ways that were much better tolerated than the original bypass. Gastric bypass remained for decades the gold standard for surgical weight loss and was associated with significant and durable weight reduction in most patients, along with improvements in conditions like type 2 diabetes that in some cases amounted to remission. And then, in the 1990s, came the adjustable gastric band. The lap band, manufactured by a company called Enamed Health and later Allergan, was approved by the FDA in 2001 and represented something significant: a surgical intervention that was reversible, adjustable, and less invasive than the bypass. A silicone band was placed around the upper portion of the stomach, creating a small pouch that limited food intake. The band could be tightened or loosened through a port placed under the skin, adjusting the degree of restriction. The lap band became very popular very quickly. Between 2001 and 2011, approximately 180,000 lap band procedures were performed annually in the United States. The marketing was sophisticated and optimistic, and it targeted not only severely obese patients, the population for whom bariatric surgery had traditionally been reserved, but increasingly the moderately overweight, people who had failed with drugs and diets and who were offered surgery as a next step. The lap band was presented as a controlled, patient-managed tool. The adjustability was presented as a feature of safety. Unlike the bypass, which could not be reversed, the band could be modified. If things were not going well, they could be changed. This was true. It was also true that things went wrong with the lap band with a frequency that the early promotional literature did not emphasize. The complications that emerged over years of follow-up were significant. The band could slip. The stomach could herniate through the band, creating a condition that required urgent surgical revision. The band could erode, migrate through the stomach wall into the interior of the stomach, which was both dangerous and painful. The port could fail. The tube connecting the port to the band could kink or break. And perhaps most significantly, the band often stopped working. Patients found over years that their bodies adapted to the restriction, that they learned to eat around it, that their weight returned despite the device's presence. By the early 2000s, the lap band's failure rates were becoming very difficult to explain away. Studies showed that 40% to 50% of patients required reoperation within 10 years for band removal, revision, or conversion to another procedure. Long-term weight loss maintenance rates were substantially lower than the 5-year outcomes that the initial approval studies had shown. The enthusiasm for the device that had characterized the 2000s was cooling markedly by 2013 and 2014 as the follow-up data accumulated. Allergan, which had acquired Enamed and with it the lap band franchise, conducted what might charitably be called a gradual retrenchment. The device was not withdrawn, it remained on the market, but prescribing rates declined substantially as the surgical community updated its practice guidelines, and as the patient testimonials that had driven the device's popularity were replaced by a different kind of testimonial. The experiences of women who had undergone multiple revision surgeries, who lived with chronic pain from complications, who had lost weight and then regained it, who were left with the lasting physical consequences of a device that had not delivered what it promised. These women's stories are harder to find in the official record than the clinical trial data. They exist in patient forums, in surgical complication registries, in the legal filings that accompanied the various lawsuits brought against the device's manufacturer. The litigation established that adverse event reports had been filed over years, that the complication rates were known, and that the marketing had not fully reflected what was known. This is the same sentence in a different arrangement that describes fen-phen and dexedrine and the rainbow pills and the thyroid extract of the 1920s. The marketing does not fully reflect what is known. The gap between what is known within the system and what is communicated to the patients inside it, that gap is one of the most consistent features of the entire 120-year story. It is a feature, not a bug, The system is not designed to close that gap. It is designed around the management of that gap, to keep it narrow enough to maintain regulatory approval and broad enough to sustain the commercial activity that depends on not disclosing it in full. This is not a comfortable observation. It does not apply uniformly. There are practitioners and researchers and regulatory officials who work very hard to close the gap, and their work has consequences, and those consequences are part of the story too. But as a structural feature of the pharmaceutical and medical device industries, as they interact with the weight loss market, the gap is persistent and characteristic. The surgical era did not end. It continued, evolving. The lap band declined in favour of the sleeve gastrectomy, a procedure that removed a large portion of the stomach, creating a narrow tube that both reduced capacity and altered hunger hormones, in ways that produced more durable results. Sleeve gastrectomy became the dominant bariatric procedure through the 2000s and 10s, and its outcomes were generally better than the bands. The bypass remained the most effective long-term option for the most severe cases. But even as the surgical options were evolving, something else was happening in the laboratory. A class of drugs that had been developed for diabetes was revealing a weight loss effect so profound that it was beginning to make the surgical option look, in some cases, almost redundant, and the industry that had built the fen-phen empire and the lap band enterprise was watching very closely. The cycle was about to turn again, and this time the turning would happen faster and at a greater scale than anything in the 120-year history of the problem had yet produced. Outside, the night is very still. There is nothing left to decide about. There is only the slow settling of things, the way the day compresses itself into the particular heaviness of the hours before sleep. The bariatric surgery era developed its own particular relationship with the cultural context of weight. Surgery was, in a sense, the logical endpoint of the pharmaceutical logic. If the problem was the body's inability to regulate its own consumption, and if pharmaceutical tools for managing that regulation kept producing harms, perhaps the answer was to change the body's structure rather than its chemistry, to make the overconsumption physically impossible rather than chemically unwanted. This logic had a certain coherence. It also had a certain dystopian quality that the era's medical and commercial culture largely chose not to dwell on. The idea of permanently restructuring a healthy organ, the stomach, to prevent it from doing what it was designed to do in the service of an ideal weight derived from actuarial tables, was not something the mainstream medical or cultural conversation examined very carefully. The surgery was presented as treatment. The body being altered was presented as pathological. The procedure was positioned as restoring health, not as accommodating a cultural demand. The clinical outcomes for bariatric surgery, particularly for patients with severe obesity and related comorbidities, were and are genuinely significant. The improvement in type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and other obesity-related conditions following bariatric surgery is real and substantial and has been well documented in large long-term studies. For a specific patient population, the surgery is a genuinely beneficial intervention. This is important and should not be minimized. The question that the lap band era raised, and that the bariatric surgery era more generally raises, is about the expansion of that definition, the movement from a narrow clinical population for whom the evidence clearly supported intervention to a broader market population for whom the evidence was less clear and the risks were less clearly outweighed by the benefits. The FDA's initial approval of the lap band required a BMI of 40 or above, or 35 with a related health condition. Within a few years of approval, advocacy for expanded indications was underway, and the prescribing, in the loose sense that a surgical procedure can be prescribed, was moving into less clearly indicated territory. The lap band manufacturers understood that their market was limited if they stayed within the original indication. The weight loss surgery market had been growing, but the truly large market, the market that would make the product commercially significant at scale, required reaching patients with lower BMEs, patients who were overweight rather than severely obese, patients for whom the clinical evidence for surgery was much thinner. The commercial incentive was clear. The clinical justification required construction. The construction of clinical justification is a process that the weight loss industry has been engaged in throughout this history. It involves the funding of research designed to support the desired conclusion, the presentation of favourable data at conferences and in journals, the development of relationships with key opinion leaders in the relevant medical specialty, and the cultivation of patient advocacy organizations that speak in the language of health need rather than commercial opportunity. None of these activities is uniquely deceptive. All of them are standard commercial practice. Together they constitute a systematic effort to shift the evidence base and clinical norms in the direction of expanded use. The lap band's failure to maintain its market position in the long run had as much to do with the accumulation of its own evidence as with any regulatory action. The complication rates and revision rates that emerged in long-term follow-up studies were published in surgical journals and discussed at surgical conferences, and gradually changed the practice patterns of surgeons who saw the long-term data. This is science working, albeit slowly. The mechanism by which science corrects itself is often exactly this. The long-term data, accumulated over years of clinical practice, diverges from the short-term data on which approval was based, and the clinical community updates its practice accordingly. But the women who had received the lap band during the years between approval and this update were not retroactively protected by the update. They had already had the procedure. Some of them had already had the complications. Some were in the middle of revision surgery proceedings that they had not anticipated when they agreed to the original procedure. The update came for future patients. The past patients lived with the past decisions. This too is structural. The regulatory and clinical system optimizes for future practice. It cannot retroactively undo the consequences of past decisions. The women who were in the lap band failure population, who had undergone multiple surgeries, who lived with ongoing complications, were in the gap between the past decision and the future update, and the gap was their bodies. The 2000s saw bariatric surgery consolidate around the procedures with the better long-term evidence, the gastric bypass and the sleeve gastrectomy. The lap band declined. The surgical field became, if not perfectly organised, at least better organised around the evidence that was available. And the GLP-1 drugs, arriving with their unprecedented weight loss efficacy, began to raise the question of whether surgery would remain the last resort option it had been, or whether it would be displaced, at least partially, by pharmaceutical management that could achieve comparable outcomes without the permanence and the risk of an operating room. Semaglutide was first synthesized in 2012 by researchers at a Danish pharmaceutical company called Novo Nordisk. It was designed as a treatment for type 2 diabetes, a drug that mimicked a naturally occurring hormone called GLP-1, which was involved in regulating blood sugar after meals. The mechanism was well understood. The drug worked by stimulating insulin release, slowing gastric emptying, and reducing appetite. It was effective for blood sugar control. The weight loss it produced in diabetic patients was, initially, noted as a useful secondary effect. The FDA approved semaglutide for type 2 diabetes in 2017 under the brand name Ozempic. It was a subcutaneous injection, administered once weekly using a pre-filled pen. The design of the pen was elegant, compact, auto-injecting, the process taking seconds. The drug required a prescription. It was significantly more expensive than the drugs it would eventually displace from the diabetes formulary. For the first years of its existence, Ozempic was primarily a diabetes medication. It was effective. It reduced HbA1c, the marker of average blood sugar, more substantially than most available alternatives. And the weight loss continued to be noted and studied and published. And gradually the weight loss numbers began to attract a different kind of attention. In 2021, Novo Nordisk published the results of the STEP trials, Semaglutide Treatment Effect in People with Obesity, a series of large randomized controlled trials studying a higher dose formulation of semaglutide in patients who were obese but did not have diabetes. The results were remarkable. Participants in the highest dose trial lost an average of 14.9% of body weight over 68 weeks. This was a weight loss magnitude that had not been achieved by any previous pharmaceutical agent without the concurrent application of surgery. It was, in the vocabulary of the field, unprecedented. Wegovy, the high-dose semaglutide product designed specifically for chronic weight management, was approved by the FDA in June 2021. The announcement was received by the medical and media communities with a level of enthusiasm that the word unprecedented barely captures. Headlines declared that the era of the effective weight loss drug had finally arrived. Physicians who had spent their careers telling patients that medications were limited in their weight effects were reading study data that challenged the assumption behind that counsel. The cultural uptake was extraordinary. Ozempic, the original lower-dose diabetes formulation, became the specific brand name that entered popular consciousness, even as Wegovy was the specifically approved weight loss product. Celebrities began referencing it. Social media generated enormous content around before and after images. A shortage developed. Patients with type 2 diabetes who needed the drug for blood sugar management found their prescriptions disrupted because the supply was being absorbed by people using it for weight loss, including people using it off-label without the severity of obesity that the approval specified. By 2023, Novo Nordisk had become one of the most valuable companies in Europe, briefly overtaking LVMH as Europe's largest company by market capitalization. A pharmaceutical company that made a diabetes drug had, through the cultural phenomenon of Ozempic, achieved a scale of commercial and cultural relevance that its founders could not have imagined. Tirzepatide, the dual GIP/GLP-1 agonist developed by Eli Lilly under the brand names Mounjaro for diabetes and Zepbound for obesity, was approved for weight management in 2023 and showed even greater weight loss than semaglutide in its trials, with participants losing an average of 22.5% of body weight in the highest dose trial. The pipeline of GLP-1 and related drugs expanded rapidly, with multiple pharmaceutical companies developing competitors. The enthusiasm was real, and the clinical evidence behind it was stronger than anything that had preceded it in the weight loss pharmacological history. The STEP trials and the comparable tirzepatide trials were large, rigorously designed, and produced clear efficacy signals. The drugs worked. They produced significant sustained weight loss in most patients. For some patients, those with severe obesity, multiple related health conditions, decades of failed alternative approaches as the drugs appeared genuinely transformative. And yet the cycle has a recognizable shape, and from a position some distance outside the enthusiasm of 2023, certain questions present themselves with some insistence. The drugs produced weight loss that was sustained while the drug was being taken. What happened when patients stopped taking them had a clear and consistent answer in the available data. The weight returned. Not slowly, not partially, but in most patients, substantially and relatively quickly. A drug that requires indefinite continued use to maintain its effect is, structurally, not a cure for the underlying condition. It is a management tool that creates its own dependency, not a pharmacological dependency in the stimulant sense, but a physiological one. Stop the drug, lose the effect. The implications of indefinite use were not trivial. Wegovy was priced at approximately $1,300 per month in the United States in 2023, a price point that placed it outside the realistic reach of most uninsured patients and that created significant insurance coverage battles. Patients who achieved excellent results and whose health improved substantially would face, at some point, either the ongoing cost of continued use or the return of the weight they had lost. The healthcare systems of every developed country were looking at the cost of covering these drugs at population scale and struggling with the arithmetic. The long-term safety profile, the effects of 10, 20 or 30 years of use, was not yet known. It could not be known in 2023 because the drugs had not existed for that long. The available safety data was compelling. The adverse effects most commonly reported, nausea, vomiting, constipation, were unpleasant but generally manageable. Some cases of a serious condition involving the pancreas had been reported. The causal relationship was being investigated. Some cases of a rare form of thyroid tumour had been observed in animal studies, though not clearly established in humans. The signals were real enough to be tracked, and not yet large enough to constitute established contraindications for most patients. This is exactly where the cycle is, as of 2025 and 2026. The drug is working. The enthusiasm is genuine. The evidence is real. The long-term data does not yet exist. The safety questions are being monitored. The cost questions are unresolved. And the social context, the evaluation of women's bodies, the commercial infrastructure that depends on that evaluation, the pharmaceutical industry's extraordinary capacity to monetize the gap between how women are told to look and how they actually look, is unchanged. From inside this moment, the GLP-1 era looks like a different story from the Dexedrine era, and the Fen-Phen era, and the lap band era. The drugs are better, the evidence is stronger, The regulatory scrutiny is more sophisticated. All of this is true. From outside this moment, from the perspective of someone who has read this entire 120-year history, who knows how each previous era looked from inside its own enthusiasm, the question is quieter and more uncomfortable. Not whether the drugs are effective. They are. Not whether the enthusiasm is justified. In individual cases, it clearly is. But whether the pattern that has characterized every previous era, the gap between short-term data and long-term consequences, between the marketing and the prescribing information, between what is known within the system and what is communicated to the patients, whether that pattern has been broken this time. The answer to that question is not yet available. It will be available eventually, as it always is, when the data catches up with the enthusiasm. That is simply how medicine works, and it is not a reason to refuse effective treatment. But it is a reason, a gentle, historically grounded reason, to hold the enthusiasm of any given moment with a degree of care. The women who will receive that data are living now. They are taking their injections, or deciding whether to, or watching the discourse about the drugs with the particular attention of people who have been in this place before, who have had other things recommended to them, who have followed other prescribing guidelines, who have had reasons to hope that this time at last the solution was complete. They are doing the most human thing. They are hoping it works this time. The GLP-1 story is worth examining in some detail because it represents, in several ways, a departure from the pattern, as well as a continuation of it, and the departures are real and significant even as the continuities are also real and significant. The first departure is the mechanism. GLP-1 receptor agonists work differently from everything that preceded them in the weight loss pharmacological history. They are not stimulants suppressing appetite through adrenergic mechanisms. They are not surgical alterations of the digestive tract. They are medications that mimic a hormone the body already produces, that act through pathways involved in the body's natural regulation of satiety and gastric emptying. The weight loss they produce is, in many patients, experienced not as the chemical suppression of hunger, but as the return of what hunger normally feels like, the ability to feel full, the reduction of the constant preoccupation with food that many patients with obesity report as a feature of their condition. This phenomenological difference is medically significant and has been reported consistently in patient accounts. The GLP-1 drug experience, for many patients, is not the driven, elevated mood, appetite-annihilating experience of the amphetamine era. It is quieter, more physiologically comfortable, more like the body regulating itself normally than like the body being overridden by a chemical. This difference in subjective experience does not tell us anything definitive about long-term safety, but it does suggest that the mechanism of action is genuinely different in ways that matter to patient experience. The second departure is the quality of the clinical evidence. The STEP trials for semaglutide and the SURMOUNT trials for tirzepatide were large, well-designed, rigorously conducted studies. They were not short-term trials presented as evidence of long-term efficacy. They were 68-week trials that produced clear, consistent, reproducible results across a range of patient populations. The effect sizes were large enough that the findings were not dependent on the statistical manipulation of marginal results. The scientific quality of the evidence base for the GLP-1 drugs is, by the standards of weight loss pharmacology, exceptional. The third departure is the scale and speed of the cultural and commercial response. The GLP-1 drugs achieved a cultural prominence in a shorter period than any previous weight loss pharmaceutical. The combination of social media, celebrity culture, the healthcare podcast ecosystem, and a mainstream news media hungry for the weight loss story of the decade produced a discourse around Ozempic and Wegovy and Mounjaro that was qualitatively different from anything that had preceded it. The discourse was not just about efficacy. It was about access, cost, equity, the philosophy of weight management, the ethics of medically assisted weight loss, and the implications of a drug that produced dramatic results for the bodies that took it. This discourse is itself a departure. The Dexedrine era did not produce a comparable public conversation about what it meant to manage weight pharmaceutically. The Fen-Phen era produced one, but it was largely retrospective, organised around the harm rather than the phenomenon itself. The GLP-1 discourse is happening in real time, while the drugs are being used, by people who have access to research, to patient communities, to journalism, to each other, in ways that were not available in any previous era. Whether this discourse produces better outcomes, whether the real-time public conversation about the cycle produces any meaningful interruption of the cycle, is the open question of the current moment. The discourse exists. The skeptical, historically informed voices exist within it. The evidence that the weight returns when the drug is stopped is publicly known and widely discussed. The cost question is publicly contested. The question of who the drugs are for and whether the broad market adoption makes clinical sense is being raised by physicians and health economists and patient advocates in public, in ways that parallel evidence might not have been raised in earlier eras. And yet, the prescriptions are being written, the market is growing. Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly are investing in production capacity at a scale that assumes the market will be very large for a very long time. The pharmacy benefit managers are negotiating with insurers over coverage. The weight loss clinics of the 2020s, now often online, accessible through telehealth platforms, offering rapid GLP-1 prescribing to patients who describe their weight and receive a prescription within a 24-hour window, are operating with a clinical lightness that has a structural resemblance to the rainbow pill clinics of the 1970s, even as the specific drug they are prescribing is a different and better product. The 10-year questions about the GLP-1 drugs exist, and they are being asked, and they will be answered eventually. The thyroid tumour risk noted in animal studies will be tracked in human populations over years. The long-term cardiovascular outcomes in the broader market population, not the high-risk patients in the approval trials, but the modestly overweight people accessing the drugs through telehealth platforms, will be characterized in post-market surveillance studies that take time. The question of what happens to metabolism and appetite regulation in patients who use these drugs for 10 or 20 years and then discontinue them is a question the current evidence cannot answer. These questions are not evidence that the drugs are dangerous. They are evidence that the drugs have been on the market for a short time, and that short-term evidence cannot substitute for long-term evidence, no matter how rigorous the short-term evidence is. This is a statement about epistemology, not about the drugs. It applies to every pharmaceutical product at every stage of its history. The cycle is in its enthusiasm phase. This is a real phase. The enthusiasm is based on real evidence. The question that the previous 120 years of this story asks insistently is what the evidence that is not yet available looks like when it arrives. Every previous era answered that question in its own way. The current era will answer it too. The answer will come in the data. It always does, it just takes the time it takes. There is a particular clarity that comes from reading the whole arc of a thing, from standing at sufficient distance that the individual moments stop being moments and start being pattern. It is not a comfortable clarity exactly, but it is a useful one, and it is worth spending time with it here in the quieter part of the evening, when the history has been laid out and before the conclusion arrives. The weight loss cycle has 5 phases. These phases have been present in every era covered in this story, from the tapeworm pill to the GLP-1 drug, with such consistency that they begin to look less like a historical accident and more like a structural feature of an industry operating in a cultural environment that has maintained, for 120 years, the same fundamental premise, that a woman's body is a problem and that someone should be paid to solve it. Phase 1 is the arrival. A new solution emerges, sometimes from pharmaceutical research, sometimes from the fringe, sometimes from the adaptation of something designed for a different purpose. The solution is accompanied by evidence of its efficacy, which at the moment of its emergence is genuinely the best available evidence, and which genuinely does show that the solution works, at least in the short term, in the population studied. The arrival is greeted with enthusiasm proportional to the scale of the unmet need, which in the weight loss space is always very large. Phase 2 is the adoption. The solution moves from the laboratory or the clinic or the fringe into mainstream medical practice and commercial availability. The detail men visit the doctors, or their modern equivalents do, the pharmaceutical representative, the conference presentation, the journal supplement. The prescribing guidelines are updated, or the product is stocked on pharmacy shelves, or the weight loss clinic opens its doors. The adoption is rapid, because the demand is inexhaustible and the solution appears to meet it. Phase 3 is the peak. The solution is at the height of its cultural and commercial moment. Dexedrine in 1964, Fen-Phen in 1996, Lap-Band in 2007, Ozempic in 2023. At the peak, the solution is everywhere. The prescriptions are being written in their millions. The advertisements are running. The success stories are circulating. The women who have done well on the solution are visible and enthusiastic. The women who are having problems are not yet visible, or are being attributed to individual variation rather than systemic pattern. Phase 4 is the signal. It begins in the margin of the literature, in the experience of individual patients, in the observations of clinicians who have been watching their patient populations long enough to notice something the trials did not show. The signal is real but small. It is processed slowly because the commercial and institutional infrastructure surrounding the solution has significant reasons to process it slowly. It grows. It becomes harder to ignore. Studies are designed to investigate it. The studies take time. The time is measured in years, sometimes decades, and during that time the solution is still being prescribed, the adoption is still proceeding, and the harm is still accumulating in the body of lived experience that does not appear in any formal aggregate. Phase 5 is the reckoning. It arrives at different velocities in different eras, faster in the post-thalidomide regulatory environment, faster still in the era of electronic health records and systematic pharmacovigilance. But it always arrives. The solution is withdrawn or reclassified, or quietly stopped being prescribed, or discovered to require permanent use to maintain its effects. The harm is documented, and the documentation is genuinely useful, and the women who experience the harm are partially vindicated in the sense that their experiences are acknowledged. And then, without pause, the industry begins assembling the next solution, because the demand is still there, exactly as large as it was before because the cultural premise that produced the demand has not changed. And the cycle begins again. Reading this pattern is not the same as concluding that all weight loss treatments are harmful. That is not what the history shows. What the history shows is that treatments that are effective in the short term have consistently been adopted at a scale and a pace that outran the evidence for their long-term safety. That the commercial logic of the weight loss industry and the clinical logic of medicine have consistently aligned in ways that prioritized efficacy data over safety data, short-term outcomes over long-term ones, and aggregate prescription rates over the experiences of individual patients who are struggling. Reading the pattern is also not the same as dismissing the experiences of women who have been helped by these interventions. The woman who took Dexedrine and found, for the first time in years, that her days were manageable. Her experience was real. The woman who took fen-phen and lost significant weight and reduced her diabetes risk. Her experience was real. The woman taking semaglutide in 2024 and finding that her relationship to food has changed in a way that has improved her health and her quality of life. Her experience is real. The reality of individual benefit does not cancel the reality of systemic harm, and the reality of systemic harm does not cancel the reality of individual benefit. Both things are true, simultaneously, at every point in this story. What the pattern suggests, what 120 years of the same cycle suggest, is that the solution to the problem the weight loss industry has been addressing since the Tapeworm Catalogue is not primarily pharmaceutical. Not because pharmaceuticals cannot help, they clearly can, but because the problem is not primarily pharmaceutical. The problem is cultural. The persistent, commercially motivated, medically endorsed, socially reinforced conviction that a woman's body as it actually is insufficient. That insufficiency has been monetized into one of the largest and most durable industries in the history of commerce. The tapeworm pill did not create that insufficiency. It found it already there and sold to it. Every solution since has done the same thing. The solutions have gotten more sophisticated, the evidence has gotten stronger, the efficacy has gotten more impressive, and the insufficiency has remained constant, because the insufficiency is not about bodies. It is about what bodies mean, and what bodies mean is determined not by pharmacology, but by culture, and culture changes much more slowly than a drug's approval timeline. A woman who understands the cycle has a kind of map, not a map that tells her what to do, that is between her and her physician and her own experience of her own body, but a map that allows her to locate herself on the landscape, to know that when a new solution arrives with extraordinary enthusiasm and 5-year data, there are 10-year questions not yet answered, to know that the gap between the marketing and the prescribing information is a feature, not an accident, To know that her experience of difficulty, if it comes, is not a personal failing, but a predictable consequence of a system that is not, fundamentally, designed around her interests. This is not cynicism. It is, in a strange way, the opposite of cynicism. It is the kind of knowledge that allows a person to engage with the system without being entirely at its mercy, to take the things that help and hold them clearly, without the unrealistic expectations that the marketing creates and that make the eventual disappointment so corrosive, to recognize the limits of the evidence without rejecting the evidence, to understand that the system has interests that are not identical to her interests without concluding that it has nothing to offer. The women in this story, the woman with the tapeworm catalogue, the woman with the orange bottle on her kitchen counter, the woman at the Fen clinic, the woman navigating the cost of a monthly Wegovy prescription, were and are smart people, living inside a system that was designed to extract value from their bodies. They were not naive, they were not credulous, they were doing the reasonable thing in each moment, given the information available in that moment. The information that was not available in each moment is exactly what this story is. Hold it gently. It is not a reason for fear, it is a reason for the particular kind of clear-eyed care that allows a person to look at something honestly and decide from that honesty what to do. The morning will come, the catalogue will be on the table, and she will read it with her own eyes. The 120-year cycle has one more element that has not yet been named directly, and it is perhaps the most important one for a woman living inside the current moment to understand. It is the question of who benefits from each phase of the cycle, in ways that are distinct from the question of who is harmed. The pharmaceutical companies benefit from the enthusiasm phase. The sales, the market capitalization, the return on research investment, all of this accrues during the years when the product is working and the harms are not yet visible. The regulatory withdrawal or the market shift that marks the end of the enthusiasm phase does not claw back the profits from the enthusiasm phase. The harms and the profits are distributed across different time periods, and the entities that bear them are often different entities entirely. The healthcare institutions benefit from the complexity that each pharmaceutical era produces. The cardiac evaluations after Fen were a medical service. The bariatric revision surgeries after lap band complications were a medical service. The management of amphetamine discontinuation, to the extent it was managed, was a medical service. Each era of pharmaceutical harm produces a corresponding era of healthcare utilization, and the healthcare system that charges for services is not disadvantaged by the production of harm that requires services to manage. The legal system benefits from the litigation that each major pharmaceutical harm produces. The attorneys who built their practices around the Fen litigation, the lap band litigation, and the various other mass-tort pharmaceutical cases of the past 40 years have been significant commercial actors in the aftermath of pharmaceutical disasters. Their work is sometimes, often, genuinely important in producing accountability and compensation. It is also economically rewarding in ways that give the legal system a financial stake in the production of pharmaceutical harm. These beneficiaries are not villains, exactly. They are participants in a system that has organized itself around particular incentive structures, and those incentive structures reward certain behaviors and produce certain outcomes. Changing the outcomes requires changing the incentive structures, and changing the incentive structures requires the kind of sustained regulatory and political attention that is very difficult to maintain in the face of well-funded commercial interests that prefer the current structures. This is the structural analysis. It is dry and abstracted from the individual experiences that fill the rest of this story, and its dryness can make it feel less real than the woman in the kitchen with the orange bottle. But it is the level at which the cycle actually operates and at which it might theoretically be interrupted. The individual woman's knowledge of the cycle changes her relationship to it. The structural change of the cycle's incentives would change everyone's relationship to it. There have been small structural changes across this history. The Kefauver-Harris requirements for efficacy evidence changed the standards for drug approval. The informed consent requirements of the 1970s changed the clinical relationship in some ways. The adverse event reporting systems developed by the FDA through the 1980s and 1990s improved post-market surveillance. The conflict of interest disclosure requirements that developed in the 1990s and 2000s made at least some of the commercial relationships between physicians and pharmaceutical companies visible. These are real changes. They have made some things better. They have not interrupted the cycle. The cycle has adapted to each of them, as commercial systems adapt to regulatory changes, finding the new channels, the new gaps, the new forms that allow the same fundamental activity to continue in a format the new rules accommodate. The cycle is patient and flexible and very well funded. The regulatory system is slower and less funded and carries the institutional inertia of all large systems. This is not a counsel of despair. It is simply a description of the landscape. The woman who understands the landscape is not helpless within it. She can choose to work with the pharmaceutical tools available to her while holding them with appropriate skepticism. She can evaluate her physician's recommendations with the additional context of knowing where those recommendations come from in the commercial and medical ecosystem. She can recognize when the enthusiasm phase of a new solution is producing claims that exceed the available evidence. She can be, in the language that the whole 120-year story earns, a more informed participant in decisions that concern her own body. The women's health movement of the 1970s was, in its deepest form, a movement about exactly this: the right to be an informed participant rather than a passive recipient. Our bodies, ourselves, was a manual for informed participation. The feminist health clinics that developed in that era were experiments in informed participation at an institutional level. The patient rights frameworks that developed from the 1970s onward were the legal and regulatory expression of informed participation. That movement did not resolve the structural issues that produce the cycle, but it changed the relationship between women and the medical system in ways that are durable and important. The women who are making pharmaceutical decisions in 2025 and 2026 do so with more information, more rights, more access to research, and more cultural permission to question their doctors than any previous generation of women in this history. This is progress. It is incomplete progress, but it is real. It is. The catalogue on the kitchen table in 1900 offered one solution. The prescription pad in 1963 offered another. The Wegovy telehealth platform in 2024 offers a third. The solutions change. The landscape within which they are offered has changed in some ways for the better. The woman reading the catalogue, or the prescription, or the telehealth intake form is better equipped than she used to be to read it critically. She still has to read it. It is still on the table. The industry will put the next one there in due course, as it always has. But she has this history now. And history, held carefully and without despair, is a kind of map. Not a perfect map. Not a map that shows every road, but a map that shows the shape of the terrain, and that is better than no map at all. There is a particular kind of knowledge that only accumulation can produce. Not the knowledge that comes from study or observation, but the knowledge that comes from being alive long enough, or from reading the accounts of enough people who were, that patterns become visible that were invisible to anyone standing inside any single point of the pattern. The women who will be making weight management decisions in 2026 are standing inside the current point of the pattern. They have access to better information than any previous generation in this history. They live in a media environment that can, when it is functioning well, surface the historical context for current pharmaceutical enthusiasm in real time. They have access to patient communities online where aggregate experience is exchanged with a speed and richness that would have been unimaginable to the woman standing alone in her kitchen in 1962. They have access to the long record, which is what this story is. What that record suggests, not prescribes, not dictates, but suggests, in the careful way that a long history suggests rather than commands, is a set of questions worth bringing to any encounter with a new weight loss solution, pharmaceutical or otherwise. The first question is about the data. How long was the trial? Who was in it? Who funded it? The length question matters because the cycle's structure depends precisely on the gap between short-term efficacy and long-term consequences. A 16-week trial that shows dramatic weight loss tells you very little about what happens at 2 years, at 5 years, at 10. The duration of the enthusiasm phase is often determined by how long it takes for the long-term data to catch up with the short-term evidence. Knowing the duration of the trial tells you something about how much catching up is still ahead. The question of who was in the trial matters because drug effects are not uniform across populations, and the populations studied in approval trials are not always representative of the populations who will use the drug at market scale. The fen-phen trial studied a certain patient profile. The market that adopted fen-phen was much broader than that profile. The GLP-1 approval trials were conducted in patients with obesity and related conditions. The telehealth market reaching people with more modest weight concerns is a different population. Whether the efficacy and safety findings from the trial population translate to the broader market population is always a question, and it is always a question that can only be answered by data that does not yet exist at the moment of market launch. The funding question is important and not simple. An industry-funded trial is not automatically a biased trial. The STEP trials for semaglutide were industry-funded and are regarded by most independent researchers as rigorously conducted. But industry-funded research does, in aggregate, show a statistically significant tendency to produce results favourable to the funding entity, and this tendency is robust in the literature. Being aware of funding does not mean dismissing the findings, it means holding them alongside that awareness. The second question is about the mechanism. How does this work? What is it doing specifically in the body? The mechanism question is not just scientific curiosity, it is a probe for unintended consequences. A drug that works by suppressing appetite through adrenergic stimulation will have adrenergic effects throughout the body, not just in the appetite regulation systems. A drug that works by slowing gastric emptying will affect digestion more broadly. A device that restricts stomach capacity will affect nutritional intake beyond caloric restriction. The intended effect and the complete effect are never the same thing. Understanding the mechanism at least sketches the space where unintended effects might be found. The third question is about the permanent versus the temporary. If you stop taking this, what happens? This question has received more public attention with the GLP-1 drugs than with any previous weight loss treatment, partly because the answer is so clear and so widely discussed. Stop the drug and the weight returns. This clarity is valuable. It establishes, before treatment begins, that the decision is a decision about continuous use, not a decision about a finite course. Continuous use has different implications from finite treatment, different cost implications, different monitoring implications, different risk profiles. The question of what happens when you stop is a question worth asking explicitly with your physician before you start. The fourth question is the historical one, and it is the quietest and perhaps the most important. Has this worked before, not for the individual patient, but for the category of solution? What do the 30-year outcomes look like for people who manage their weight primarily through pharmaceutical intervention? The honest answer, based on the history covered in this story, is that the long-term outcome data for pharmaceutical weight management has consistently been less favourable than the short-term data, and the pharmaceutical industry has consistently moved to new solutions before the long-term data on previous solutions was complete. This is not an argument against pharmaceutical weight management. It is context for evaluating claims made in the current moment. These questions are not the questions of a person who distrusts medicine. They are the questions of a person who takes medicine seriously enough to engage with it honestly. The difference is not cynicism versus trust. It is informed engagement versus uninformed acceptance. The medical system works better, is more accountable, produces better outcomes, when the people inside it ask good questions. The history of this 120-year cycle is in part a history of what happens when the questions are not asked, or when they are asked and not answered, or when the answers are not transmitted to the people who need them. There is also a question that runs underneath all the specific pharmaceutical questions, and it is the one that the 120-year cycle has been circling around without directly addressing. It is the question of the original premise. Why does the problem exist at all? The problem that generates the solutions, the problem that drives the cycle, the problem that has been commercially productive for over a century. The Metropolitan Life Insurance tables that declared certain weights ideal were not derived from research into what weight promotes health and longevity. They were derived from actuarial data about mortality rates in a specific population at a specific historical moment. The ideal they declared was a commercial artifact. The medicine that adopted it as a health standard was borrowing a commercial artifact and treating it as though it were a medical finding. The BMI, the body mass index, which has been the dominant metric of weight-related health assessment since the 1980s, has a similar origin problem. It was derived by a Belgian mathematician named Adolphe Quetelet in the 19th century as a statistical description of the central tendency of human weight distributions in a specific European population. It was not designed as a health metric. It was not validated against health outcomes. It was adopted by the healthcare and insurance systems in the 1980s as a convenient, universally applicable measure that could be calculated from two numbers, height and weight, and could be used to categorize patients into weight status groups that could then be assigned health risk estimates. The health risk estimates associated with BMI categories are real, in the aggregate sense that population-level data shows elevated disease rates in higher BMI categories. But the relationship between BMI as a measure and individual health outcomes is much weaker than population-level correlations imply. The same BMI in two different people can represent very different metabolic situations. The BMI does not measure adiposity directly. It measures weight relative to height, and it systematically misclassifies people with high muscle mass as overweight and people with low muscle mass as normal weight. It was designed for European populations and performs differently in Asian and African populations. As a tool for individual clinical assessment, its limitations are well documented and widely acknowledged in the research literature, and much less widely acknowledged in clinical practice. None of this is to say that weight is unrelated to health. The relationship between excess adiposity and conditions like type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, certain cancers and joint disease is real and clinically significant. This relationship is worth taking seriously. What is worth questioning is the metric used to measure it, the cultural weight given to that metric, the commercial interests aligned around it, and the 120-year history of solutions that have addressed the metric without consistently improving the health outcomes it is supposed to represent. A woman who has read this far has some version of this history available to her now. Not as a reason for fatalism, the system is too large and too durable for individual knowledge to dismantle it, but as a reason for the particular kind of engaged, skeptical, historically informed participation that makes individuals harder to harm and systems more accountable. She is still in the waiting room. The appointment is still coming. The prescription pad is still on the other side of the door. But she's sitting in her chair with a different quality of presence. Not the presence of someone waiting to be told what to do with her body, but the presence of someone who has some idea of the landscape outside the window, who knows something about where the roads go. That knowledge is worth having. It has always been worth having. The history was always available in fragments in the experiences of the women who lived through each era. What is different now is simply that more of it has been assembled in one place, that the pattern has been named, that the cycle has been made visible. Visible things can still harm you, but you navigate them differently when you can see them. The appointment is nearly ready. The nurse will call your name soon. You know a little more than you did when you sat down. That is enough for tonight. That is more than enough. The 120 years covered by this story contain a vast number of individual women whose experiences are not directly named here. The histories of race and class run through this story in ways that deserve acknowledgement, even in a narrative that cannot fully do them justice. The weight loss industry has not operated uniformly across populations, and its harms have not been distributed uniformly. Black women and women of colour have faced specific forms of this story's dynamics. The BMI metric, derived from data on European populations, has been applied to diverse populations in ways that do not account for the documented differences in the relationship between BMI and adiposity, or between BMI and metabolic risk, across different ethnic groups. The insurance tables of the early 20th century were built from data on populations that largely excluded Black Americans, who faced discrimination from many life insurance companies through explicit policy or through the mechanism of medical evaluation that applied different standards. The weight loss drug trials that form the evidentiary basis for pharmaceutical approvals have historically enrolled populations that are overwhelmingly white, which means the safety and efficacy data that drives prescribing has not been generated in a representative sample of the populations to whom the drugs are ultimately prescribed. This is a known limitation in clinical trial methodology, one that the FDA has increasingly required manufacturers to address in trial design, but one that affects the evidence base for several of the drugs covered in this story. The cost dimensions of the cycle have also operated with profound inequality. The weight loss solutions that have been most commercially successful in each era have also tended to be the most expensive. The Ozempic and Wegovy prescriptions that are priced at over $1,000 per month without insurance are not accessible to the majority of Americans who would, by clinical criteria, qualify for them. The solutions that are accessible without the cost barrier, the OTC products, the cheaper online programs, the products at the bottom of the quality distribution, have consistently been the ones with the worst safety records. The inequality of harm across the 120-year history is not incidental. The rainbow pills that were most dangerous were concentrated in the cheapest weight loss clinics, which served the populations who could not afford the better regulated alternatives. The adulterated patent medicines of the early 1900s were cheapest where regulation was weakest, and they were consumed most heavily by the populations with the least capacity to absorb their costs. This is the structural dimension of the cycle that sits underneath the pharmaceutical history and the feminist analysis in the regulatory story. The harms of each era have not been distributed randomly. They have followed the gradient of economic and social vulnerability with the reliable logic of all systems that extract value from people who have limited alternatives. The woman with fewer options takes the cheaper drug. The cheaper drug is less well regulated. The less well regulated drug is more likely to harm her. The harm happens in the body of the person least able to seek accountability for it. These patterns are not unique to the weight loss industry. They are characteristic of how commercial healthcare operates in markets where access is mediated by cost. But they are present, clearly and consistently, in this 120-year story, and any telling of the story that does not name them is incomplete. The women whose experiences this script cannot name, the black women who received different clinical treatment at every stage of this history, the poor women who could afford only the cheapest and most dangerous products, the women of colour whose bodies were evaluated against standards built from other populations entirely, are present in the aggregate statistics even when they are absent from the named accounts. Their experiences are part of the pattern. Their silences in the historical record are themselves a part of the story. A more complete history would pursue them further. This story gestures toward them as an acknowledgement that the version of the 120-year cycle described here is a partial one, told primarily through the experiences of white middle-class women in America and Europe because those are the experiences most visible in the surviving record. The incompleteness is real. The record it is built from is incomplete, and the incompleteness itself is a feature of the system that produced the record, not an accident of history. Come back now to the waiting room. It is 1958, and the room smells of floor wax and old magazines and the faint antiseptic that waiting rooms always smell of. Not unpleasant, just specific. Just the smell of this kind of time. The time you spend waiting for someone to tell you something official about yourself. The chairs are upholstered in a green that was probably cheerful when it was chosen and is now simply familiar. The magazines on the low table have been read and replaced and read again. A woman is sitting in one of the green chairs. She's wearing a coat she did not bother to remove because she does not plan to be here long. She has an appointment in 15 minutes. She has a weight that is above the number on the insurance table. She has a doctor she trusts and a prescription pad waiting on the other side of the consultation room door and a hope, a very ordinary, very human hope, that today might be the day something changes. She does not know what she doesn't know. This is always the condition of the person in the waiting room. The knowledge that would protect her, the 10-year data, the cardiac studies, the long history of the thing that is about to be prescribed to her, is simply not there. Not because anyone has deliberately withheld it, but because it does not yet exist. The evidence that would accumulate over the next decade of her experience, and millions of women's experiences like hers, is waiting in the future with the patience of something that does not know it is being waited for. She picks up a magazine. She reads it without really reading it. The clock moves. The receptionist calls her name. This is where we leave her. Not in the consultation room, not at the pharmacy counter, not at the kitchen counter with the orange bottle, but here in the waiting room, in the moment before. Because the moment before is the one that this whole long story has been preparing us to see differently. Not with judgment. She's doing nothing wrong. Not with pity. She does not need pity, but with the particular quiet attention that comes from knowing where this goes and understanding from that knowledge something about where we are right now. The world is quieter now. The waiting room is far away. You're somewhere warm and still, and the day has finished its last errand and is letting go of you. Let it. Let the image of the waiting room grow soft and indistinct. Let the green chairs blur. Let the old magazines lose their titles. Let the clock on the wall slow down and then stop. Because clocks in this hour don't need to keep time. There is no appointment. There is nothing to be weighed. There is only the comfortable dark and the slow, reliable work of breathing in and breathing out. The 120 years of the story are finished for tonight. The Tapeworm catalogue has closed. The orange bottle has been set on its shelf. The Fen clinic has shut its doors. The GLP-1 injection pen sits in its small refrigerator, waiting for morning. All of these things are in their places. None of them require anything from you in this particular hour. The women of this story were remarkable in the way that ordinary people are remarkable when history goes looking at them closely enough. They managed things the system didn't prepare them for. They adapted to losses the system never named. They carried the weight of decisions that were made for them by institutions that had their own interests, and they carried it quietly, and they got on with the days that followed. There is something worth keeping from this story. Not the pharmaceutical history, which is interesting but is history. Not the regulatory timeline, which matters but is not what you carry home. What is worth keeping is simpler. It is the recognition of the cycle, the ability to locate yourself on the landscape, to notice when the enthusiasm is very large and the evidence is very new, and to hold that combination with the clear eyes of someone who has been here before, even if the precise era is different. And with that, and with the warmth that is already settling back into your shoulders, and the weight of your own body against whatever is holding it, mattress, cushion, the familiar pressure of the ordinary comfortable surfaces of your life, let the thinking ease off. There is nothing left to figure out tonight. The story is told, the waiting room has emptied, the clock is quiet. You have nowhere to be but here, exactly here, in the soft dark of the ending of this long and wandering evening. Sleep well. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. And one last thing I'd love to know, is there a moment from this history that surprised you, or a diet trend from your own lifetime that you can now place somewhere on the cycle? Leave it in the comments. I read every one. The history of the weight loss cycle is not a history that ends. It is a history that turns and turns and turns again, each turn taking somewhat longer than the enthusiasts of that turn would like to believe, and somewhat shorter than the victims of the previous turn have had time to fully process. The remarkable thing, the thing that is worth carrying into sleep, is not the cycle itself but the persistence of hope within it. At every point in this 120-year story, the women who were taking the new solution were not simply naive. They were hoping. The hope was real even when its object was insufficiently examined. The hope was the response of real people to real suffering, to bodies that hurt or that were told they should hurt, to lives organized around managing a problem that the culture had declared important, even when the culture's declaration was itself the problem. Hope is not a trivial thing. It is one of the most human of responses and one of the most persistently useful ones. It is also, in the weight loss context, one of the things most systematically exploited by the industry that has served the cycle for a century. The exploitation of hope does not make the hope itself wrong. It makes the exploitation worth naming and understanding and accounting for. The woman in the waiting room in 1958 was hoping. The woman at the Fen clinic in 1995 was hoping. The woman navigating the insurance approval process for Wegovy in 2024 is hoping. The hope connects them across the decades, across the pharmaceutical eras, across the regulatory changes and the lawsuits and the withdrawals and the discoveries. They are all doing the same fundamental thing, trying to manage a situation the culture has defined as urgent, using the tools the culture has made available. This is not a reason to despair about hope. It is a reason to pair hope with knowledge. The combination, hope informed by the pattern, optimism grounded in historical literacy, is not a guarantee of better outcomes. Nothing in this history suggests that individual knowledge reliably protects individuals from systemic harm. But it is something. It is the best available thing, in the absence of the structural changes that would require a different kind of story entirely. And so, in the soft close of this very long evening, what is left is not a verdict on the industry or the cycle or the women inside it, but a kind of companionship. The companionship of having travelled through the same long history together, of having sat in the same imaginary waiting rooms and walked the same imagined suburban streets and stood at the same kitchen counters where the orange bottles sit. The history is not a comfortable one, but it is a real one, and real things examined honestly are always more useful than comfortable fictions. You are better equipped, having heard this, than you were before you heard it. That is what the history is for. That is what tonight was for. The waiting room is quiet now. The clock on the wall has stopped. The magazines are still on the low table, and somewhere, in the distance, the day is already preparing what it will offer tomorrow. Its problems and its pleasures and its catalogue of solutions to problems that may or may not be real. You will know how to read the catalogue. That is something. That is enough. Sleep now. You have earned it.